Yo, Atlas speaking, and welcome to part 12 of What If I Was Reincarnated in the Naruto world as the legendary Konoha outsider. Let the tale begin. Chapter 222, Jack of All Trade. A horse-drawn carriage trundled along a wide road towards the enormous defensive walls surrounding the spring city of U. The brick wall was actually an earthen wall erected 40 years ago with the help of shinobi adept at using earth-style ninjutsu and afterward covered in baked bricks as another layer of fortification. The main gates to U were indefinitely closed, with only the smaller commercial gates used by merchants and traders still open as access points into the city. The carriage driver slowed down the horses as they approached the gates and joined the short line with him at the front after 5 minutes. "What's your business?" It was around lunchtime, and the gate was being guarded by the local civilian guards with only one enemy shinobi sitting in the little cabin. There were 4 guards stationed at the gate. 2 of them stayed near the gates, keeping a vigilant eye on the queue of carriages. The other 2 checked the carriages. The carriage driver motioned the guard toward the carriage. Before the guard moved, the carriage opened, and Gaku stepped out. His scruffy stubble was shaved clean, his rough hair with gray strands were cleaned, dyed, and tied in a silky ponytail, and his face looked thoroughly moisturized. On top of that, he was dressed in an exquisite silk robe. "Good day, gentlemen," he said. "What's your business?" the guard said, looking Gaku up and down. Before Gaku could answer, Daiki stepped out of the carriage, towered behind Gaku, and stared down at the guard, who had the expected reaction of nervousness. Gaku smiled. "The enchanting courtesan Chinatsu is returning to you. She and her 3 maids are inside. The 5 of us request entrance into the city." "Oh? I have to verify that." The guard's face brightened up. He walked past the Gaku and Daiki and looked inside the carriage. The inside was dark, casting a shadow on the passengers. The guard naturally looked at the woman talking to him and was instantly enthralled at the first sight of the bodacious woman. Despite being dressed in a full robe, her sensuality couldn't be hidden. She was the courtesan Chinatsu. Other than her, there were 3 more women in the carriage dressed simply and had veils covering their faces just like Chinatsu. The scent of her fragrance tickled the guard's nose, and he was left without words. He gazed into the eyes that seemed to focus on only him and him alone. "You're beautiful, my lady. I must check you and the other ladies for illegal contraband." The guard stepped closer and reached for Chinatsu, but before he could grab her, a hand that could completely cover his whole head grabbed his wrist. The guard looked back and saw Daiki staring down at him, and the guard felt a shudder shoot through his feet. The guard tried to pull his hand out of tight grip but couldn't even move Daiki's arm 1 centimeter. "You unhand me, you brute." "Forgive him, he's just doing his job." "I'm afraid the courtesan doesn't like being touched by unclean hands," Gaku said and gave Daiki a nod. Daiki released the guard's hand but put himself between the carriage and the guard, then closed the carriage door. "I appreciate all the hard work you do to keep the city safe, and I want to make sure you get awarded plenty for it." Gaku flicked his wrist, and the note bundle slid into his hand. He pressed the thick roll into the guard's hand. The guard smiled, but when he glanced at his hand, he was surprised by 2 bundles resting in his grip. He looked up at Gaku, who smiled. "The second is something extra just for you." Alerted by the commotion and the guard's loud sound, the second guard came to see what was happening. "What's happening here?" The first guard quickly pocketed one of the rolls. "Nothing much, just this," he said, tossing the second roll to the other guard. "Ah, I see, so it's all good," the second guard smiled. "Well then, let's get moving." It didn't matter if their home was occupied by the enemy, not everyone felt loyal or patriotic to their country. Their only allegiance was to the ones in current. As long as their lives weren't disturbed, they didn't care who sat in the ivory towers. Greedy people were still enthralled by coin, power-hungry men's appetite for control over others was just as intense, and the self-centered ones who only thought about themselves were still interested in only themselves. The guard was grinning at getting his bribe, but then he saw Daiki boarding the carriage after Gaku and remembered how Daiki had grabbed his wrist. His happy expression soured as he moved along. He saw the carriage driver and scoffed. "Hey, take off your hat." The carriage driver sighed and raised his hand, but apparently it was too slow. The guard raised his staff and flicked the straw hat off the driver's head, revealing the face of one tired Takuma. "Dear God, when was the last time you slept?" the guard said, forgetting the humiliation he had felt. "They wanted to get here quickly." "They paid extra, boss," said Takuma. "Oh, extra? How about your share, kid?" He used his staff to poke Takuma in the leg, strong enough that it would have hurt a civilian. Takuma slowly turned his head to the guard. Their eyes met, and the guard froze up as he felt as though a kunai had pierced through his neck. He gripped his staff until his knuckles were white and took a step back. His hand went to his neck like he was scratching an itch, but he was checking his neck. What? You got a problem?" Takuma put his hand into his pocket, which scared the guard, but Takuma took out a few loose, crumpled, dirty notes and held them to the guard, who hesitated but stepped close to snatch the notes out of his hand. "Good, now move on, you're blocking the line," the guard tried to sound tough. Takuma softly urged the horses and headed inside the city. As the carriage passed through the gates, he glanced at another carriage inspected by the other guard, who was ripping jute bags full of the merchandise, spilling a considerable amount on the floor. When the merchant begged him to stop, the other guard roughly pushed him to the ground and threatened him to stay there as he continued his inspection. Takuma then glanced into the guard cabin, where a lone shinobi was leaning in his chair, puffing smoke. He put his straw hat back and entered the spring city of you. The carriage stopped in an alley before a building's back entrance. Takuma stepped down from his seat and looked around to see if someone was peeking from the windows. He opened the door, and Gaku and Daiki stepped out first. "I thought I was never going to get out of there," said Daiki. "Why were you the only one outside?" Gaku spat, a cigarette already in his hand. "Because I'm the only one who knows horses," Takuma said. He had learned how to ride horses because shinobi didn't use horses, they ran everywhere, which was why he learned it because it made for such a great cover. And today, he had gotten the return on his investment. Gaku went ahead and unlocked the building while Daiki went to the back of the carriage for Chinatsu's belongings, the only luggage not sealed away in storage seals. Takuma held out his hand to help Chinatsu down the carriage. "Thank you, sweet boy," Chinatsu smiled, winking at Takuma. He nodded and extended his hand for the next one, only to get it slapped away. Kimiko pulled off her veil and pushed Takuma's straw hat up to see his face. "Ugh, I couldn't believe they could get worse," said Kaneko, commenting on Takuma's worse-than-usual bags under the eyes that were ever present on his face. "Sure, let's do this in the street," Takuma sighed. The preparation time was shorter than Takuma anticipated despite the mission being delayed. Between team meetings and his personal preparations, 14 days passed in the blink of an eye. And because of the stakes involved, he hadn't been able to sleep properly due to being busy and stressed. His usually tired face had gotten worse than usual. Anko kicked Kimiko from within the carriage to move the latter out of the way. "What?" Anko looked at Takuma and Kimiko and spoke in a no-nonsense voice. "Shut the fuck up, and move along." Riku and Iori stepped outside the carriage and followed the other women into the building through the back entry. After Daiki unloaded the luggage, Takuma patted the horses and returned to his driver's seat. "Thank you for your service, fellas. But it's time for us to part." Now, he had to get rid of the horses and the carriage and familiarize himself with the city and its roads. Takuma returned with food for the entire group. The land and the building was owned by a company Gaku owned under a fake identity. He had made quite a bit of money in his time as a shinobi and had invested a portion into real estate. The building was a 2-story residential house with a full basement floor. "You are great out there, Chinatsu," Gaku said to the woman whom the guard had tried to lay his hands on. "It was all you, my brave Gaku," Chinatsu smiled flirtatiously. Chinatsu was the reason why the mission was delayed. Gaku had recommended her as a potential asset to Takuma. Chinatsu was a high-end courtesan with connections in the city's high society and had agreed to help them as a plant that could collect intellect. Takuma agreed to recruit her if only for the cover to get into the city. He wasn't sure how much helpful information she could get for them. She was the reason the mission was delayed from 7 days to 14 days. Everything from doing a background check on her to contacting Chinatsu to have her to agree and then getting her transported was done extremely quickly, but it took time to coordinate and execute, which delayed the mission. The group sat in a circle on the dirty floor with the food Takuma had bought for them. Rest for today, Anko addressed the group. We start from tomorrow. Gaku and Chinatsu will spread the word about her return. Chinatsu was their cover. Gaku was the pimp, Daiki was the muscle, and Anko, Riku, Kamiko, and Iori were Chinatsu's maids. Chinatsu had returned to the city and would be conducting her business, reconnecting to her past clients/lovers, and the team was actually going to help her do her business. The entire team except for Takuma. He didn't have a cover and thus wasn't connected to Chinatsu's group. If he got in trouble, it wouldn't connect back to him. If he got into trouble, it wouldn't get tracked back to Chinatsu. Anko continued. While they do that, Iori and Daiki will get the stuff for the house. Kamiko and I will do the cleaning. Takuma will set up the other place. We start the initial recon after everything is set up. The plan was to put a distance between Chinatsu's house and the place where the team was planning to make their base of operations. They had brought a lot of stuff that would feel very out of place in a courtesan's place of residence. Remember to stick to your roles, everyone, Anko said. She turned to Takuma, and get some sleep, you look like a ghoul. I will, Takuma sighed. It was their first day behind enemy lines, but Takuma felt that it was his chance to get some decent sleep because once he started doing recon, his head would be filled with information, goals, and plans that would keep sleep away from him. Chapter 223, Propaganda War. Takuma wandered the streets of Yu alone, observing the city on foot. He had completed his task of setting up the base in the abandoned factory handpicked by Gaku. The cleaning took the majority of time as he wanted a thorough job because, unlike the others, he was living in the base. The furnishings of the base were pre-prepared and brought from the outside, sealed in scrolls. Setting them up was a quick couple-hour job. The others were still busy with their jobs, and Takuma decided to explore the city independently. He put on civilian clothes that would allow him to carry a concealed weapon pouch and took off to roam the central part of the city. He didn't have any specific objective and simply wanted to take in the city's atmosphere. The city was still very much functional, with people continuing on with their lives, but as he looked around, he could see the weight of the enemy's presence bearing down on the town. The streets were emptier than what Takuma would expect from a city of Yu's size. As he passed through a bazaar, many shopkeepers weren't calling out to the customers like one would expect from a bustling center of commerce. He passed a mother who had dressed herself and her 2 children in plain clothes that covered them from head to toe and was keeping them close as though in fear that they could be stolen from her at any moment. He even hid in the shadows and watched 2 young men harassing a woman in the middle of a noticeably busy street, but not one passerby stopped to help the woman who had been pushed to tears. Takuma guessed that the reason why the fruit shop owner, with hate in his eyes, wasn't already swinging the machete in his hand was because of the red armbands on the 2 young men. He had seen them on the gate guards and others while driving through the city. According to Gaku, the city police wore armbands. Since the enemy had occupied the city, they had put the people who turned to support the new powers into the police to keep the population in check. They were using the people of the city against themselves. It was a classic tactic to maintain control. Hey, what are you 2 doing? A middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, wearing the same armband, came running, and the young men immediately stopped and stepped away from the woman. Unlike the young men wearing casual clothes, the new middle-aged man wore a proper uniform. He tried to help the woman pick up the bag she had dropped but got his hand slapped away. The woman bowed to him despite looking thoroughly livid and ran away. The man stared at the woman, looking depressed, before immediately ripping into the 2 men with harsh words. They looked displeased but stood there in silence, listening to the scolding, though it looked like they weren't really listening to the older man. Takuma moved on and continued roaming the city when he noticed red posters plastered on the walls. Looking closer at one, the notices were propaganda about how the occupying shinobi forces weren't enemies but liberators who were rescuing them and giving them an opportunity to live a better life. He looked around, ripped one of the posters, and folded it into his pocket. Takuma then saw a roadside stall manned by an old man selling shaved ice. "The pink one," said Takuma, paying up front. "Coming up," said the old man with a balding head. As he shaved the block of ice, he asked, "So where are you from, young boy?" Takuma titled his head. "Down west." "How did you know I wasn't from here?" "You passed by one of those traders and had no reaction. No hate, joy, fear, you didn't look away to avoid their eyes. Everyone in this city would have a reaction, but all you had was indifference," the old man laughed. "Huh," Takuma was impressed. "Tell me, boss. What's it like living here?" "It is what it is." The old man looked around. "This city is the grain storage for all the farming villages in the region. Every season, the farmers sell their hard-grown crops in the city. That hasn't changed. The farmer doesn't care if we're occupied by the enemy, they have mouths to feed, and city folk need food. Ever since those shinobi arrived, suddenly there's no food, and the price of everything shot up. You was the hub for the farming villages selling their produce in the big city. The city had built infrastructure to store grains, and mills to grind them, among other things that the smaller farm villages lacked, and having a central hub made more logistical sense. Many farmers sold their entire harvest to the city itself, who would sell it to whoever needed it. Everyone from big businesses to small vendors bought from the city." "You mean they're holding back the food?" said Takuma. "Of course, what else could it be? They have been forcing the farmers to only sell to the city. They're forcing anyone who needs food to buy it from the city because there's no other choice." The old man then whispered, "I asked one of the farmers who came here after harvest season, he said that this year's harvest was abundant." Takuma glanced at the shuttered restaurant behind the old man's stall on wheels. He looked around and didn't see any other stalls. The old man himself was selling shaved ice flavored with bottled syrups. "Here you go," the old man handed him a shaved ice on a stick. "Thank you, old man," Takuma gave him a smile and continued his walk. Gaku was in you during the enemy invasion. He continued to stay in the city for months before he was contacted by the Hidden's team to come out to help with a mission. According to him, the shinobi lived in an affluent part of the city. And as Takuma walked toward that part of the city, he noticed how empty the city got. He didn't see anyone for a good few minutes, it seemed the population was staying away from the shinobi. Then he saw a group of shinobi laughing as they came down the street. Takuma jumped into tall grass and lay there watching them as they passed by. They passed him by quickly, but Takuma continued to lay in the tall grass for a few more minutes before getting up and walking away, deciding that he had done enough exploring for the day and that the next time he wanted to explore the area, he would do it at night with darkness as his ally. When Takuma returned to the base, some of the team members were waiting for him. He noticed that Gaku, Daiki, and Iori weren't present in the group. "Where were you?" Anko had her arms crossed. "Out, I left a note," said Takuma. He pointed at the small note which said, "Out, we'll be back in the evening." "You weren't supposed to be out." "So, what did you find?" "Where are the others?" "Iori and Daiki are at the house." "Gaku is out spreading the word," said Riku. "Are we sure he's doing that?" asked Takuma, pulling out a MRE meal, ready to eat, from the stock of rationed pre-prepared meals they had brought from the outside. He was hungry after his walk and hadn't eaten since morning. He sighed as he looked at the MRE. With the food prices in you, he wouldn't be eating fresh food a lot. "You really don't trust him, do you?" said Kamiko. Takuma shrugged. He had tried to apologize to Gaku and start anew with a positive attitude, but Gaku wasn't receptive, and unlike the duty clone, Takuma couldn't see anything good about the guy. The sound of Gaku's voice and his stupid face was irritating. They had done satisfactory work during the preparation period, but Takuma did not trust Gaku. "They have done a good job at maintaining control over the city," he said, telling the team what he had seen. "I think I have the first course of action. I found these plastered around the city. He pulled out a few different red propaganda posters he had ripped off the wall and put it on the sheet metal table for the team to see. They're controlling the amount of food the city has access to, artificially raising the prices. They blame the land of hot waters for forbidding the villages to sell their harvests to the city because it has been occupied, trying to spread the impression that their nation has abandoned them. But I heard something interesting, he said. The team looked up from the posters to Takuma. An old man told me that most farmers continue to sell their produce directly to the city. And he gave me the impression that the farmers sold without much resistance, which tells us that the enemy bought at a fair market price, but that means they spent money. Where is that money coming from? I doubt they're using military funds, it's a lot of produce. Kamiko's eyes lit up. They're selling the produce somewhere else? Takuma snapped his fingers and nodded. Yes, they're exporting the food to the land of frost. I read in a report that you has stopped all exports to other cities, but they're continuing to buy produce, and seeing that they're keeping the city hungry, they must have a lot of inventory. It would be a waste to let it all go to waste, Anko completed his sentence. Right. They're keeping the population hungry to control them while also using it to spread misinformation. But most importantly, they're making it so that the farmers don't need to look elsewhere to sell their crops. By simply maintaining the existing relationship, the enemy got control over the entire region. They targeted you for this very reason. It would be bad for the land of frost if the farmers selling their produce to you suddenly took their business elsewhere. They needed to keep the population fed, and if the farmers turned away, they would have to import food into you from the land of frost, meaning that another area in the land of frost would have less food. The war wasn't just about land and territory, it was also about the people. By keeping it all the same as before, the farmers were kept happy, and the land of frost also got an additional food supply that they could sell into their territory. And that was likely to continue as long as you was under the land of frost's control. I think we need to shake this propaganda they're trying to spread before it's too late, said Takuma. Too late? Asked Riku, confused. I believe it's only time before they start ramping up the food available in the city, returning to normal. It will create the impression that while the land of hot waters has abandoned them, the land of frost has embraced them as their own. We must disrupt the plan by revealing the truth before the entire city switches sides. And how do you say we do that? Asked Anko. Takuma held up one of the red posters. We copy the enemy, he said. We make similar posters debunking the propaganda they're trying to push and plaster our posters around the city for the people to read. Okay, said Kamiko with hum. When Gaku returns, we have him find a printer to make prints. No, that won't work, Anko shook her head. Yeah, I thought of that first, but that's not suitable. When the enemy sees our posters, they will visit every printer in the city to find who printed them. We will be burning a civilian, Takuma sighed, but he had an alternative. I know how to use woodblock printing. We carve a piece of wood as a template, dip it in ink, and stamp it on paper like a stamp. The quality won't be as good, but I think it'll work. He could carve wood, and they had a few Nin on the team to handle ink. No, we don't need that, said Anko, staring at the posters. We can have the posters brought in from outside. How? Asked Takuma, furrowing his brow. Like we brought everything in here, Anko said, pointing to everything in the base. In a sealed scroll? But who will send the message and bring them in? My babies, of course, Anko smiled. Chapter 224, Conversant. Hajime, a sensory Nin of the Hidden Leaf stationed at Camp Banana, strolled across the makeshift earthen perimeter wall that covered the village center. In his case, the stigma surrounding sensory Nin, that they were only good at their sensory capabilities, was somewhat true. After all, they were hired solely for their special capabilities and nothing else, working extremely long hours that left them very little time to develop their other skills. Hajime embodied the stereotype to the highest degree. He was only useful because of his sensory capabilities, but he didn't mind because he was outstanding at it, even compared to other sensory Nin. He was content with being a hyper-specialist as that's what got him good jobs, and he didn't see that changing anytime soon. Putting all his time and effort into his sensing capabilities allowed Hajime to clock the chakra signature, moving rapidly toward Camp Banana. He turned to the thick woods bordering the camp, where he sensed the chakra. He judged it to be a high-grade one on the sensorinine scale, but it took him by surprise because the chakra felt was nothing like he was used to feeling from most grade 1 threats. Despite that, he rang the alarms and notified the entire base about a potential intruder and incursion. He felt people in the base flare up their chakra, which overwhelmed his senses for a moment. In the handful of seconds it took to steady himself, he lost track of the chakra signature. He sharpened his focus and quickly reconfirmed his senses on the signature, only to realize it was next to him. Hajime looked around, but he didn't find anything. "Be careful, the target might be a master of stealth," Hajime warned the others on guard duty. As he continued to look around with a kunai in his hand, he heard a hissing sound. Hajime looked at the wall around his feet and froze up when he saw the slitted, sickly yellow eyes of a forest green snake as thick as his arm and as tall as he was. Before he could move or scream, the snake lunged at him, completely trapping and immobilizing Hajime in its coiling, serpentine body. "You have sharp senses, human," the snake hissed, its head a few centimeters away from Hajime's face, "but those senses are a big problem for a predator like myself. Maybe I should make you into a meal." Hajime was beyond terrified and couldn't produce a peep from his mouth. He could only stare at the snake with his quaking wide eyes. The other guards couldn't move as the snake had Hajime in its grasp as a hostage. The snake's forked tongue touched Hajime's cheek, making his entire body flinch and break out in cold sweat. Just as he thought he was about to become its dinner, the snake laughed loudly, and Hajime found his legs free as the snake coiled its entire body around his torso, arms, and neck. "Unfortunately, I'm not here for a meal," the snake said. "Mitarashi Anko has sent me. Walk me to the humans named Shirakumo and Toradesu. I bring them news from her." Hajime, of course, knew Anko and also knew that she was infamous for her snake summons. Hearing Anko was the one to send the snake, he calmed down from utter terror to stiffness from fear. It's okay, Chunin Mitarashi has sent the snake," Hajime announced loudly as he awkwardly turned his body to face the other guards because the snake was still coiled around his neck, and he didn't want to make any movements. He spoke respectfully to the snake, "Can you please let me go? I'll happily lead you to the Jonin." "No, you take me," said the snake, and Hajime could sense that the snake wasn't going to take a no for an answer. "Oh, okay," Hajime gulped. He announced, "I'm talking the snake to see the Jonin. Clear a path." Hajime jumped down the wall, and by then, the shinobi in the base had already gathered near the wall, fully decked in combat gear. They cleared a path for Hajime, who didn't need to walk much as Shirakumo stood in the middle of the road. "Release my shinobi," Shirakumo said, sounding dead serious. "Not with all these human shinobi around me, ready to hunt me down," the snake hissed. "My time with Orochimaru hasn't left a great impression of you humans. I like my Anko, but I can't say the same for all of you. Most of the time when she calls me, I end up killing and eating your species." The snake's yellow eyes scanned the entire area, and the weak-willed in the crowd looked nervous or looked away when their gaze met the snake's. Shirakumo frowned with displeasure at the mention of Orochimaru. The shinobi gathered around and looked nervous and scared at the mention of the snake Sannin. "You're the one called Shirakumo, correct?" asked the snake. "Give me your word that I won't be harmed, and I will release this human." "Does that mean my words mean nothing in Anko's eyes?" said Toradesu. The slits in the snake's eyes narrowed as he turned his head back to see Toradesu standing behind Hajime. The snake moved around Hajime in agitation, coiling a bit tighter, making Hajime grunt in pain. The fact that he couldn't sense someone as dangerous as Toradesu standing so close to him wasn't something the snake welcomed. "What, scared?" asked Toradesu, tilting his head. Shirakumo felt a growing tension between the snake and Toradesu and interjected before it became a problem. "I give you my word that you won't be harmed." "I assume you have word from Anko, let's talk about it inside," said Shirakumo. The snake's eyes remained affixed on Toradesu for a moment before he opened his maw and sank his fangs into Hajime's shoulder. "Rest assured, I will give him the anti-venom when we're done. As you humans put it, it's insurance, said Mara, the snake. Mara sat with Shirakumo and Toradesu in the war room. Neither of the Hidden Leaf Jonin looked very pleased with Mara injecting Hajime with his snake venom. Their sensory nin was in a fatal condition after getting injured inside the base while the two Jonin stood by and watched. What does Anko want? Asked Shirakumo. Mara sat coiled on the large table, taking nearly half of the tabletop. He opened his maw for a scroll tube to emerge from his body and dropped down on a table covered in spittle. Mara flicked the scroll tube across the table with his take. The scroll tube stopped in front of Toradesu, who used a handkerchief to pick it up and open the tube to retrieve a scroll from inside. Toradesu read the scroll and then handed it to Shirakumo. It's legit, said Toradesu. The scroll had Anko's handwriting and a secret code to validate the legitimacy of all communication between the U-Team and the base. She wants us to print posters for them. They move quick, said Shirakumo. He looked to Mara. We give you the posters, and she summons you into the city. That's the plan, Mara said, hissing. Summons sure are convenient, Shirakumo said with a deep exhale. In the shinobi world, summons were in high demand due to their sheer usefulness, but contracting a summon species was an extremely rare opportunity that only a few were lucky to have. And even those who had signed summon contracts had to pay a prize in return for having intelligent animals capable of using chakra at call. There was a rumor revolving around Orochimaru that the bigger, more powerful snake summons required human sacrifice every time they were summoned, and Orochimaru very happily sacrificed a large amount of people every time he needed help from the behemothean serpents that struck fear in the hearts of his enemies. You have 3 days. I will come to collect the posters sealed in a scroll that fits in that tube around this time of day in 3 days, said Mara, pointing at the scroll tube covered in snake spittle. Oh, you're leaving. What a pity, said Toradesu, his words dripping in sarcasm. I'll be in the nearby forest. Warn your humans to be careful if they visit. I might mistake them for prey. Mara laughed and then slid it off the table, heading towards the door. The anti-venom, Shirakumo stood up, looking ready to stop and grab Mara on a moment's notice. Mara might be a big snake, but he wasn't a Jonin. Mara laughed again, louder this time. Don't worry. He doesn't need it. I'm not a venomous snake. The snake's hilarious laughter was audible from outside the war room for several seconds before they couldn't hear it. Toradesu and Shirakumo looked at each other in silence. A snake had made up a fool out of both of them. There was a knock on the door, and the Chunin Irionin, who was looking after Hajime, stepped inside. Sir, Hajime. Toradesu cut him off. Hajime is fine, we know. Yes, sir. The Chunin Irionin got the message and immediately stepped out of the room, leaving the two Jonin alone. This is why I don't like that girl, Toradesu said to Shirakumo. Damnable snakes. Because of her duties as Chinatsu's handmaid, Riku hadn't had the opportunity to visit the base of operation in the abandoned factory. She was happy to be out of the handmaid's attire and back into her usual clothes. Unexpectedly, the handmaid's uniform was comfortable and easy to move around in, which made sense to her after she worked in them as the job required moving around doing a lot of tasks from preparing Chinatsu and maintaining the house, but she was simply more comfortable in her vest and pants that she had been wearing since she became a shinobi. As she entered the building, she saw Takuma on the other end of the long floor. The base was situated in the most isolated part of the building, in the corner with other abandoned buildings adjacent to it. The factory Gaku had chosen was abandoned because a few years back, a dangerous chemical leaked into it killing 6 people, which led to the factory's closure. The team wasn't a fan of the location despite Gaku assuring the location's safety. The other option was a haunted warehouse, but Anko rejected it because she was worried that children might use the warehouse for tests of courage, thus leading them to choose the factory. Takuma was staring at a huge plan wall he had made. Because he was the only one not tied to Chinatsu for cover, he had the most amount of time to gather information and intelligence via observation and exploration. Riku didn't want to disturb the thoroughly engrossed boy and moved silently, but when she was close enough, Takuma turned, and his eyes snapped toward her as though she was a threat. The sudden movement from him gave her a pause, but since she didn't have to worry about disturbing him, she greeted him. "Hey," Takuma returned her greeting. "You should make it more readable," said Riku as she stopped beside Takuma and gazed over the surprisingly large plans on the wall. "It's not readable?" Takuma looked at her, his brows furrowed. "Maybe to you, it doesn't make much sense to me." Riku tried to look closer, but it all seemed like a huge, chaotic mess of information thrown on a wall. "What is all of this?" "I'm trying to make sense of the city in my mind," said Takuma, pointing at a rudimentary city map in the middle of everything. "I want to know what's where so I'm more comfortable with operating here. Not knowing how this city works is scary. The more I know, the more comfortable I am." "Makes sense," said Riku, nodding. As she looked at the plan wall, she couldn't see the connections between the many clusters of notes that he had made, but she could roughly see that Takuma was focusing on areas and people in those areas. And as she thought of people, a question rose in her mind. "I didn't think sticking posters would be the first big thing we would do in the city," she said. "Oh, what did you think we'd be doing?" he asked, his eyes stuck to the plan wall as though he was obsessed with the clustered mess he had created. "Honestly, I thought we would be killing one of the enemy shinobi," Riku shrugged. She knew her answer was blockhead, but that's what she thought was the entire objective. Weaken the enemy from the inside before the main force came knocking from the outside. "You're not wrong, there'll be plenty of time for that," Takuma chuckled. "So, we're doing this because we want the residents to help us, right?" asked Riku. "Wouldn't we accomplish the same if we killed a couple of enemy shinobi? Wouldn't they be happy that someone was finally doing something?" Takuma removed his eyes from the wall to look at Riku. "Yes, we're doing this so that we would have the residents' support, but that's just an outcome of something else we're trying to prevent. The city of you still considers the Land of Frost as the enemy, but if we allow what's happening, that would change, and the city would start looking at them favorably." "I don't get it," Riku shook her head. "Why would they look at invaders favorably?" "Because we as a species aren't logical beings. After months of limited food and disrupted lives, if they return to abundant food and their lives back on track, and the enemy claims that they did solve the problem Land of Hot Water created, the people would side with the side who solved the problem." Takuma paused for a moment as he mulled on something. "For example, there's a helpless old man who's running away from a goon who's trying to kill him. And you have the option to let the old man escape. Would you help?" "Yeah, I would help," said Riku. "But what if I told you that the helpless old man raped the goon's sister who took her life? The goon was just trying to exact revenge for his sister. Would you have still helped?" "Of course not." "But you just said you would." "Because I didn't know," Riku realized what Takuma was trying to explain. "The city people don't know that the old man is the real scum and will instead think of the goon as the scummy one." "Yes," he nodded. "Imagine if our main forces come to free the city, but the city people who have been deceived get in the way. They try to help their liberators and get in between a conflict between two shinobi forces. Do you think we will mow the civilians down to get to the enemy?" Riku shook her head. Takuma continued. "Let's say we somehow got rid of the enemy without causing a civilian massacre. What now? We leave, but the Land of Hot Water is left with a city near the border full of Land of Frost sympathizers and supporters. Do you think the Hot Water Daimyo and the Hidden Steam would be able to see you as anything but a potential security threat? They would be left with a time bomb waiting to explode. So yes, I'm hoping by revealing the truth, the people will help us when we need their help, but mostly, it's because we're trying to rescue the city, and I don't want them to be doomed at the end of it all." Riku looked at the plan wall, and unsurprisingly, nothing had changed, and it still seemed like a chaotic mess to her. "I don't think I'll be much help here." "I would have killed the goon," she said. "You don't need to help with this. You just need to be there ready when it's time to kill the scummy old man," said Takuma. "I think you'll be a very good handmaid who does some killing on the side." Riku smiled. Chapter 225, Toby's Shenanigans. In the base, Anko weaved through hand seals for the summoning jutsu and slapped her palm on the ground, which spurred the jutsu formula, Shiki, using her blood as a component. A writhing snake emerged within the hazy cloud of smoke. Both Gaku and Kamiko were standing behind sheet metal tables, looking combat-ready when they spotted the thick forest green snake despite it being Anko's summon. Takuma stood beside Anko, ready to spring into action like the other two. "You guys are being rude, Mara is a friend." "He won't harm you," said Anko. She was disappointed seeing them acting like they were. "I wouldn't take her word for it," said Mara, his yellow-slitted eyes scanning the three. A snake's got to eat, after all. Gaku had crossed his arms as he kept his eyes on Mara, and Kamiko gripped the hilt of her sword tightly. "Mara, stop it!" Anko raised her voice, but the shallow smile on her face told another story. The snake looked up at Takuma, who was staring down at him. He uncoiled and raised his body until her head was at Takuma's chest. The distance between them wasn't more than a few feet, practically nothing for a snake of Mara's enhanced physique. "You look easy to swallow," said Mara. "And you have hundreds of more bones than a human I could break," Takuma replied. Mara moved his head closer to Takuma, who didn't move, much less flinch. They stared at each other for a long, silent moment. Anko, standing beside Takuma, shook her head. She was used to Mara's antics when meeting strangers. "I like him," Mara said to Anko after backing away. "Do you have the posters?" asked Anko. "I have a scroll, but I don't know what's inside," said Mara. He opened his mouth and spat out a scroll tube right toward Anko, who was forced to catch it with her bare hands. She groaned in disgust at the long strands of saliva dangling from her finger and uncorked the tube. She glanced up at Mara with a fed-up sigh and dumped the scroll within the tube into Takuma's hands. Unexpectedly, a loose rolled-up paper fell out along with the scroll. "What is it?" asked Anko, holding her dirty hands before her. "Looks like a letter," said Takuma as he read the contents. "I'm tired, I'm leaving," said Mara. "Oh, thanks!" Anko knew that Mara had been living away from his natural habitat for several days and didn't want to hold him back for any longer. Mara released the jutsu and disappeared in a puff of smoke. "Ah, the snake fucked around with the Jonin." Takuma raised the letter and put it on the table with a snort. "Took a hostage at the camp. You can read about it later, it's pretty funny." Speechless, Anko opened and closed her mouth wordlessly. She glanced at the empty spot where Mara stood a few moments later in irritation. Just when she thought she and Toradesu were over the hill too. Takuma laid the storage seal scroll on the floor and released multiple stacks of A3-size posters. The ones put up by the enemy were red-themed, so the team decided to switch the color and go with blue-themed posters. The mental association would help them, after all. "Good, these are good," said Takuma. Takuma wasn't the greatest writer. The only writing he had done recently was writing bland case reports in the police force, which showed in his poster drafts. Daiki, who read them, commented that Takuma's writing was too complex and long-winded. If Takuma wanted the message to spread, they needed the posters to be easily understandable because the posters were only the first step. The moment the enemy was made aware of the posters, they would try to take them down, and the real goal was to spread the message around the city through word of mouth. For that to happen, the wording on the poster needed to be concise and easy to understand and memorize. Daiki, being unsurprisingly well-read, turned Takuma's writing into points that could be picked up quickly after a short read. Iori contributed with rough artwork depicting the occupying enemy in a bad light to attract the eyes of the populace. Takuma looked up at Gaku. "When are we meeting the locals?" The team wasn't equipped to distribute the posters properly across the city. They weren't familiar with the hotspots where most people would see the posters. Even if Gaku were to circle out locations on the city map for the team to follow, they wouldn't know the specific areas in those locations where the posters would get the most eyes, something locals would be perfectly aware of. "We leave in an hour," said Gaku. "I have set up a meeting." "Are you sure your identity is safe?" Anko asked him. Gaku nodded. "It's safe, don't worry." Gaku was a well-known figure in U. As a retired shinobi, he was well connected with the resistance elements in the city, enough that he was on the enemy's watch list. They were constantly on the lookout for him, which meant that he couldn't be seen in the city without being hunted down by the enemy. This was why he operated in the open as Jimiai, Chinatsu's pimp from the land of Hot Water's capital who had followed her back to you. He was shockingly adept at disguises and masquerading skills. After a few light cosmetic prosthetics, body language changes, and some voice modulation, Gaku was unrecognizable, allowing Jimiai to operate in broad daylight. It helped that Gaku and Jimiai ran in different social circles. Takuma stared at the posters as a nervousness bubbled up within him. The plan's success level would dictate how the future would go for him. He needed it to succeed to inspire confidence in the team and Anko, allowing him to operate with greater freedom. Not to mention, his failure could mean Gaku trying to butt in and try to take control of the operation. No matter their current situation, he was still a shinobi from an entirely different village to Team 9. This had to go great, no, perfectly, but his part in it was done. All Takuma could do was leave the rest up to the team. A single street light hung over a shopping center loading zone, used by businesses to move merchandise and inventories. A group of 5 men looked tense as they huddled under the streetlight. "Are you sure he's coming?" The skinhead youngster who asked the question handed a hand-rolled cigarette to the middle-aged man leaning against the light pole. Motohiro was a middle-aged man with a wide frame, big arms, and a bare belly. He owned a milling business in Yu and had a considerable number of people under him. He was rich, not enough to be counted among the city's elite, but comfortable enough that he had no financial burdens. Ever since the enemy had invaded and occupied the city, he had become a community leader who people looked up to. Motohiro had taken that responsibility very seriously and had been involved in the resistance efforts. He scratched his full beard before taking a long drag from the cigarette. It did nothing to calm him down. "He said he'll be here," said Motohiro. "Don't worry. Can we trust him? Didn't he run away? Why would he return to the city if he had already run away?" Motohiro took another drag before passing the cigarette back to the younger man. "There's no harm in listening to him. If we don't like it, we can always walk. But he's a shinobi, they're dangerous." The rest of the group looked uneasy at the mention of shinobi. Even though they were part of the resistance group trying to oppose the enemy occupation, there wasn't much they could do when the enemy was an army of shinobi with a stranglehold on the entire city. One shinobi could wipe out the 5 men gathered under the streetlight and they would be dead before they knew it. "They'll be dangerous regardless of what we decide," said Motohiro. To be honest, Motohiro didn't think anything worthwhile would come from meeting with Gaku. Even before he had lost any connection to him, the shinobi wasn't very social or involved with the resistance effort. He kept to himself and had only shown up randomly at gatherings whenever he felt like it, and even then, holed himself in a corner without contributing unless prompted. Motohiro was surprised that Gaku had even contacted him. He thought he'd died and was buried in ditch somewhere, truth be told. But given that he was a shinobi, Motohiro gave the meeting a chance rather than outright ignoring the man who had been missing for longer than a month and hadn't been of any help before. Shinobi were not regular people, after all. The faint sound of approaching footsteps that set the group on the edge. As the sound grew closer, Gaku's figure stepped into the faint light. He was dressed in loose black and gray clothes and walked like he was on a late-night stroll. "I hope you've more people than these kids," Gaku said as he looked at the 4 youngsters. "Maybe," Motohiro replied. "Why do you need my men?" "Your men, huh?" Gaku smiled as he reached into his clothes, which made people shift. He took a big piece of folded paper and flicked it towards the group. The folded paper flew in a curve but landed precisely into Motohiro's hands. He unfolded the paper to reveal the red pro-occupation posters everywhere around the city. "What about it?" asked Motohiro. "We want to respond to this false propaganda." Gaku put a proper cigarette into his mouth and lit it with a Zippo lighter. "We? Who's we?" asked Motohiro. At that moment, a silent figure appeared beside Gaku, which freaked the group out. Some of the younger guys cursed and stumbled. Motohiro was only able to hide his gasp because of them. They had only heard one set of footsteps before and weren't expecting someone else to be there with them. The figure was dressed in a dark robe and had a blank white mask with long eye slits covering his face. The figure had been standing in the shadow, standing just one step away from the light, hiding from them. Who are you? Asked Motohiro. I'm someone who shares an interest with you, Mr. Motohiro, said the figure. It was a male voice, but the sound was gravelly with a hint of underlying warping. I'm interested in ridding this city of unwanted intruders so it and its people can return to their lives before this situation. You didn't answer my question. Motohiro stared at the figure. Other than his below-average height, the figure didn't give anything away. There was this person before him that Motohiro knew nothing about it, and that scared him, stopping him from believing anything he said. My name's Toby, the figure introduced himself with a slight bow. I'm not from you, but I've been sent here to help the city. Who sent you? Who do you think? The daimyo, one of the youngsters replied from behind Motohiro. There were whispers among the youngsters with hints of hope. Even Motohiro felt something swell up in his heart. Had their nation finally sent help to free them from the misery they faced under enemy rule? Your country needs your help, said Toby. I can help, but the people of the city are the only ones who can truly save it. Mr. Motohiro, you're in a unique position to start something revolutionary that will change the tide. You're a strong voice among the people, and you have done a great job to keep them together. Now's the time to reveal the truth to them. Toby took another folded piece of paper, blue, rather than the red of the enemy's propaganda, and unfolded it as he walked towards Motohiro with silent footsteps. Motohiro couldn't believe the man was walking to him. There wasn't even a sound. Shuddering, he realized that Toby was a shinobi, or at least someone very dangerous. You call this city your home and it wants you to save it. Toby stopped before Motohiro and held up the poster under the street lamp's light. With my help, you can save it. Chapter 226, Small Ninja World. Fukiko woke up early in the morning, still feeling exhausted from the last day's work, having slept for barely 6 hours. She was a single mother of preteen twins and the sole care provider for her elderly father, who couldn't do anything other than barely walk himself around the house. She hurried through a brief cold shower, which was always not enough, and rushed to make a meal for her kids after they returned from school. The family didn't always have the money for a breakfast meal, which was why Fukiko was glad that the school provided a meal during the day. With the food shortages, she was worried that the school would stop providing meals, but luckily, the city had pulled together enough to ensure that the school continued to provide the regular midday meal. Kids! Get up quickly! Fukiko yelled from the kitchen. Hurry up, or we'll be late. She stopped moving and listened closely. A few moments of silence later, she heard the sound of quarreling between the twins. Fukiko nodded and resumed her work. Fukiko. As she set up the table, Fukiko's aged father walked into the small open kitchen. He had more wrinkles on his face than a witch and a crooked back that had bothered him more than usual. Dad, did you sleep properly? I heard you shift a lot last night, said Fukiko as they put down 2 glasses of milk on the table. She turned away and yelled for the twins. Come to the table before I have to come to you. It was a bit cold, dear, said Fukiko's dad. Oh, should I take out the thicker blankets? Fukiko put on a pot to boil some water for her father, but the stove lighter suddenly stopped working. She tried twice, but there was no spark to light the gas. Fukiko's dad hummed as he nodded. He looked up at his only daughter. Fukiko, what do you think about Miyamoto's offer? Not now, Dad, said Fukiko as she tried the lighter, but there was no flame on the hob. Her father had been trying to set her up with Miyamoto, who owned an electrical company with 3 employees working for him. He had a large house and a good, steady income, but Fukiko didn't want to marry a man who was 20 years older than her. He's a good man, dear. He'll take good care of you and the kids. No, he won't, she whispered, so only she heard the words. In truth, it wasn't his age that made Fukiko wary of him. Miyamoto was once married and even had children that lived with his ex-wife at her childhood home when he kicked them out. She had asked around, and the man wanted nothing to do with his children, cutting all ties with them. Fukiko understood that her father was trying to look out for her, but she didn't have the time and energy for matchmaking. Certainly not with a man who might leave her like he did his ex-wife. With the way life was in you, she couldn't take that risk. You should at least meet him. Fukiko's hand twitched as she felt an intense irritation overcome her. I don't want to marry him. Why do you keep bringing it up? She raised her voice and smacked the stove lighter on the countertop. At the last moment, she heard footsteps and turned to see her twins standing at the kitchen door. They looked at the lighter in her hand with alarm. Fukiko took a deep breath and hurriedly turned her back to them, not wanting them to see her like that. Eat quickly, both of you, she said. She took a deep breath, pressed the clicker on the lighter for it to finally produce a spark, and lit the fire in the stove hob. As the water boiled, she took the trash out for collection. On her walk to the collection corner, she saw new blue posters much like the red ones. She didn't have any time to read whatever the shinobi had decided to put up for them and walked past them with a sigh. She didn't care about what they had to say. Ever since those shinobi had come into the city, her and her family's life had become miserable. Even if she did, she had no time. Listen to your teachers, and don't create any problems. Especially you, Arita, no fighting. Things are hard enough without me being forced to come in because of your temper. It's not just me, you know. Her son heaved a sigh and turned his moxie-filled glare at the looming building behind him. But I'll try. That's all I'm asking, she replied. Kyo, the more level-headed of the two, rolled her eyes when he wasn't looking. Fukiko kissed her twins and nudged them into the school building. The first bell was still 3/4 of an hour away, and there were barely any people in the school except for the cleaning staff. She stood there waiting until the twins were in the building before breaking into a cycle of running, jogging, and brisk walking. She couldn't bring the twins to school on time because she'd be late for work. Thankfully, the school gates opened half an hour before the actual required time. Half an hour was just long enough for her to barely make it on time. By the time she reached her place of work, a milling factory, she was out of breath and sweating from her pits. She checked the clock by the staff entrance and saw that she was a minute late and groaned with her eyes closed. Her supervisor was an old miser who took any opportunity possible to pay them less than their work deserved. So much that if any worker was late, by even a minute, their pay for half the day was cut. Fukiko couldn't afford to lose a single ryo of her pay. They were struggling as is on her regular salary. She closed her eyes, sure that any minute now, she would hear his horrible, scratchy yelling, but it didn't happen. She looked up in shock. Almost hesitantly, she shuffled into the factory, where everyone was standing around in a circle. Fukiko hoped they had gotten the fortunate news that their supervisor was dead, but when she sneaked over to the group, pretending she'd always been there, she saw the old bastard hale and healthy in the middle of the circle. It made her question what was so disturbing that even their supervisor stopped being such an asshole. What's going on? She whispered to one of the older ladies. There's a new poster. Oh, Fukiko's curiosity drained out of her. She couldn't care less. What does it say this time? Calling the daimyo an illegitimate ruler? The posters always blamed the hot water daimyo and the hidden steam for the city's miserable condition. Fukiko didn't know if it was true or not, but one thing was for sure, the posters had brought a lot of hate toward the daimyo and the hidden steam shinobi in the people. There was a government building in the center of the city built in honor of their daimyo. It was the most beautiful, clean, and respected building in the city, treated as if it were the daimyo himself, but last month, that same building had been defaced with profanity and all manner of curses towards their ruler. Nobody had bothered to clean it up. The poster says that the hidden frost shinobi and the rich folk are buying food from the farmers and diverting it to the land of frost instead of us. They weren't around yesterday and now these posters are everywhere. Fukiko was surprised and wasn't at the same time. She was surprised that the posters weren't put up by the hidden frost shinobi, but the contents of said poster didn't surprise her. I'm not really surprised, said Fukiko, shrugging. This place never looks like it has a shortage of business. Maybe Mr. Besho is part of the group who's selling the flour to the land of frost. She didn't want to sound ungrateful, so she didn't say it out loud, but the Besho mill hadn't fired a single worker no matter what they did. It being wartime and all, they couldn't afford to look for new workers right now. Shut up. The fat supervisor twisted his meaty neck towards Fukiko with a look of warning in his beady eyes. Think before you speak. Mr. Besho wouldn't be part of anything like this. We aren't even sure if this is true. But as the supervisor spoke, his confidence sank, and by the end, he didn't seem to be very sure about his words. According to what the red posters said, a majority of farmers had turned their business away from you, and only a fraction still sold to the city. There were rumors that the claims weren't true, but with the continuous food shortage, people believed their country had cut them out. However, for people like Fukiko, who saw the milling business thriving as usual, the claims made by these new blue posters allowed her doubts to click into place, and she felt an overwhelming anger bubble up inside her. The cost of living had shot up in the city. Her milling job used to be just enough for their family. Even if they didn't live extravagantly, they lived comfortably. She spent enough time with her twins, she was able to look after her aging father appropriately, and even though she didn't get much time to herself, she was content with how their lives were. But that all changed. With the prices of everything going up, she had to pick more hours at the factory, which cut into her time with her family. Her twins had to get up an hour earlier so that she could drop them off at school. She couldn't pick them up in the evenings and had to rely on a neighbor who would bring them back home. She could no longer help them with homework. Her father had started to hide his growing health problems from her to not make her worry. Even when she confronted him, he stubbornly refused to admit it. And even after all that, the increased hours didn't do anything. They were barely getting by week after week, and she had already dug into half of her hard-earned savings. In a few more months, they would truly be living paycheck to paycheck. "And why are we making such a big deal of this?" asked Fukiko. "It doesn't matter about who's doing the screwing, our lives are still miserable. I don't see this poster changing anything. Not according to this." Fukiko followed her finger, and at the very bottom, after everything else, was a single line printed in bold. "Good days are near." And below that was a symbol of two hands snapping a chain link in half. Fukiko stared at the words, fighting against the smothered hope fighting its way to life within her. A middle-aged man dressed in a bedroom robe over his underwear sipped a glass of freshly squeezed pineapple juice on ice. He sat on the luxurious balcony of his lavish estate. Two maids stood out of sight in the distance, waiting to complete his every request. In the city of U, where the common populace was struggling for food, the man had no want for food and drink, reaching out for the opulent breakfast on the table beside him. The only thing out of place from the affluent picture was the sheathed sword in a worn-down scabbard leaning against the man's outdoor lounge chair. "What is it?" said the man. A breeze ruffled the man's brown locks. The maids flinched in surprise when a man dressed in a black robe and a porcelain fox mask appeared before the man. "Lord Khan," the masked figure greeted. "Any problems?" asked Khan. "The city police force found these this morning." The masked fox handed the blue poster to Khan. Khan lazily glanced at the poster in the man's hand without taking it from him. But the next second, Khan sat up straight with sharp focus and took the poster in his own hands to read it thoroughly. "This morning, you say?" asked Khan. "Yes, sir. According to the police, the posters are everywhere. In the residential districts, the busiest commercial blocks, near diners, shopping centers, and even plastered over the posters we've put up." Khan stood up from his chair and walked to the railings at the balcony's edge. He wasn't surprised to see resistance to the various plans and designs they had in motion around the city to turn you against the land of hot waters. "All around the city?" "Affirmative, sir. Get these posters down, find the printer who made them, and arrest some of the resistance members to find the source of these posters. There's been resistance, but never like this." Khan turned to the masked fox. "I want some answers by the end of the day." The masked fox bowed before disappearing into thin air, and Khan stared out at the estate. Khan was a Root shinobi. Someone high up in the Hidden Frost hired Root as war consultants to help them in the ongoing Frost Team War, and Khan was among the team leaders sent to the Hidden Frost. His assignment was to help the Hidden Frost take over the City of You, and then convert the city over to the Land of Frost's side. His secondary objective, like everyone from Root involved in the Frost Team War, was to collect information about the alliance between the Hidden Frost and the Hidden Cloud. Their leader, Danzo, believed that the Hidden Cloud was supporting the Hidden Frost to push the Hot Waters Frost border closer to the Land of Fire, and then using their new alliance with the Hidden Frost to move the Hidden Cloud's influence more closer to the Land of Fire than it had even been. Root's objective was to get the information about the Cloud-Frost alliance so they could prepare against a threat to the Hidden Lead future. Khan didn't want to be in You. He had a great position back home, handling Root's drug trade that funded many of Root's initiatives. He was in charge of the money, and that gave him power in the organization. However, when one of their farms was raided by the Leaf military police force, and he retaliated by ordering an assassination of the person responsible for the raid, it all went wrong. The assassination failed, and he ended up costing Root 4 trainees who were a year away from becoming official agents. It was a significant blow to the organization given that the trainees were lost in a failed assassination of a lowly genin. He was punished and reassigned to the Frost Team War. He wasn't even sent to the Hidden Frost, the real information trove, and was stuck on the front lines. Khan hated the person responsible for his downfall. Jinin Takuma of the Narcotics Task Force under the Department of Organized Crime of the Leaf Military Police Force. That child had ruined his life. He swore that if one day he got the opportunity, he would have his revenge. But then the situation changed. The Hidden Leaf betrayed and turned on Root. The organization was forced to go underground in hiding. The Hokage himself hunted their leader, Danzo, who had worked his entire life for the betterment of the village. It was a great disaster for Root. The organization had lost the support of the Hidden Leaf, their home and funding. They had to relocate and reorganize quickly while the Hidden Leaf's ANBU were on the hunt for them. However, there was a silver lining, at least for Khan. Fortunately, he wasn't in the Land of Fire while all of that happened. He was in You, working on his assignment, which was suddenly extremely important as helping the Hidden Frost win the war became a high priority as Root was now an independent mercenary organization, and they needed a win to start their new chapter. Khan was now in an enviable position. Truth be told, he was happy the posters were put up. The resistance effort so far had been petulant and nothing overt. This time, he could use whoever put up the posters as an example. He didn't even need to find the true culprits, which was why he ordered Fox to arrest known resistance members. He would punish them, regardless of their actual guilt, and reward the city folk who had fallen in line with the Hidden Frost. It would show the common populace what they needed to do to gain rewards. Khan smiled. If enough complied, perhaps he'd lower the food prices. His pet dog curled against his right leg and he ran a finger along its head with a small smile. He enjoyed training dogs, but controlling human lives was so much more fun. Chapter 227, Mr. Boom. Suyo! Get me a drink, said a tall and burly man who sat down behind his dirty and cluttered desk with his feet on the tabletop. Coming right up, boss. Bungie joined his fingers behind his head and looked around the police station run by his underlings. Several months ago, he would have felt disgusted stepping into the place, but now he ran it like it was his house. The dogs who loved to meddle in his business, trying to put him behind bars for simply doing legitimate business, were no longer part of the police force. The wrench gang replaced them in the Bentetsu Street police station. It felt like a dream, but it was reality, and he absolutely loved it. He couldn't be happier with where his life was. No more living in the dark, constantly looking over his shoulder in case the police busted him. Now, he ran the territory like he owned it. In fact, he did. He wasn't sure about the shinobi when they invaded the city and took over, but when the masked men offered power and influence, Bungie was more than happy to comply with the new powers that be. It wasn't his choice. His gang was under the command of the much larger Goharu family. When the Goharu family was given power, the wrench gang got a slice of it as well. Here you go, boss. Suyo handed the glass of neat whiskey to Bungie. Bungie smiled as he took the first sip of whiskey at 11 in the morning at a police station. It was as thrilling as it could be. As long as the Goharu family continued to provide drugs to the shinobi and enforce their new laws, the Goharu family and the Range family under them were part of the new court in the city. If there was something he was dissatisfied with, it was that the Bentetsu Street police station no longer had any dogs, no one for them to make fun of or make their lives hell at the jobs they so much loved. "All right, boys," Bungie addressed his people around the station. "It's time for the weekly collection from our very willing citizens who need our protection from threats. I want the money on my desk before lunch." Bungie picked up his glass to bring it to his lips when he saw 4 figures dressed in white masks and full-length black hooded jackets enter the police station. They were covered from top to bottom, but from the overall shape of their bodies, he could tell there were 3 women and 1 man. He reached for his sword and was about to get up when he saw the group drag 2 of his men into the building and dump them on the floor. They were stationed at the front entrance as guards. "Hey, who the fuck?" Before Bungie could complete his sentence, the man, who was at least 2 meters tall, walked to the nearest pillar, punched through the concrete, and ripped out the reinforced steel wire from the structure. "Shut the fuck up and listen to what we say. A step out of the line and this will be your body," he pointed to the broken pillar, "and this your bones," he helped up the reinforced steel wire. The man threw his fistful of wire towards Suyo, who stumbled while getting back into the room. The wire bunch hit Suyo in the head, and he went down. In mere seconds, the group of 4 had put the members of the Range gang on edge. They were still silent, but every muscle in their body was on the verge of a fight or flight response. The demonstration of power was enough for everyone to understand they were dealing with shinobi, and so none of them moved. "Where's your boss?" asked one of the women. A few eyes went to Bungie, who cursed under his breath. She nodded to the taller man and the second woman who had started moving around, sticking what looked like paper tags on the walls and pillars around the building. The giant of a man who had punched through the pillar walked around the bullpen, staring everyone down like a hound ready to bite anyone who dared to move. "You're Bungie, aren't you?" The masked woman pushed the junk off the table, sat down, and stared down at Bungie, who had his sheathed sword still in his grip. The woman, who looked to be the leader, didn't seem to mind the weapon in his hands. "The city isn't very happy with your recent actions and choices, Bungie," the woman said smoothly. "The citizens in this police station's jurisdiction certainly aren't happy with Range Gang's protection fund. They feel like they shouldn't have to pay for you to do your jobs, especially with the current economic situation. Don't you think it's tough?" Listen, lady. You don't want to do this. We are backed by the Goha." The leader slapped Bungie across the face, knocking the words from his mouth. He spun out of his chair and crashed into the metal cabinet in the corner. She jumped off the table, pulled Bungie up his hair, and dumped him into his chair. Before he could gather his wits, or even get over the pain, she splashed his glass of whiskey in his face. Bungie was shocked into silence. He didn't even see the slap coming, and before he realized it, he was on the ground, and his head had made a dent in the cabinet. "I know who's backing you, but they aren't here right now." The leader grabbed Bungie's hair and softly moved his head around. "Let's not start trying to intimidate using names. We're the only ones who can do that here. You see that guy? He will punch through your chest if I tell him to." She pointed to the giant who was still roaming the area aggressively as though he were waiting for someone to step out of line. Bungie felt a phantom pressure in his chest and gulped when he saw the masked man staring right at him. "So, this is how it's going to play out. The Wrench Gang will stop collecting money from the citizens in the name of protection. I don't care if you don't do your job as proper police, because even I know that's expecting too much, but if I hear that you're going door to door collecting money, there'll be no one in this city who can protect you from me. Nod if you understand," she said. Bungie stared at the woman. He was scared and knew he had no choice, but he couldn't just fold so easily in front of his men. Even though his eyes were focused on the woman, he could feel their gaze. A surrounding pressure on the edges of his vision. He didn't nod, at least, not immediately. The woman sighed deeply. She placed her gloved palm on his chest, and Benji flinched when he felt a pressure grow on his chest every passing moment. The dainty palm grew heavier by the second, and Bungie felt like someone had placed a metal block on his chest. His breathing grew labored, and his chest moved up and down. His panicked eyes jumped from the hand to the woman's face. I said nod if you understand. Bungie took a deep breath and forced himself not to nod quickly like a pigeon. That's nice, the leader said. She then turned to face her team, who had regrouped in the bullpen. It's done, said the man. All right, gentlemen. We're going to exit the building now, so form a line. Let's hurry on this and not be stupid, or you'll die. Come on, let's get it moving, the woman spoke. Bungie's men looked at him for direction. He nodded to them, got up, and walked to the middle of the bullpen. Some men immediately fell into line behind him, others hesitated out of fear, but seeing the masked group staring at them, they too quickly joined the queue. Boss, what's happening? Shut up. Just do what they say, or do you want to die here? Bungie whisper yelled at the man behind him. In less than 30 seconds, 15 men of the wrench gang had formed a line like a bunch of elementary school kids. We're going to give all of you a little makeover, so stand still and close your eyes, the leader announced. The masked group took out spray canisters and started to spray down the gang members in a metallic blue color. In less than a minute, everyone was fully covered in blue paint and were left coughing because of the smell and fumes from the colors and canisters. We don't have much time, so move out. The Bentetsu Street police station was built on a spacious lot a little distance off the main road. There weren't any other buildings next to the road, but there was an empty lot behind it and a short road between the station and the main road. The masked group led the gang outside the police station onto the short road that joined to the main road and made them lay down on their stomachs with their arms flat by their sides. All of them except Bungie. He was in front of his man and watched as the masked men stuck the paper tags. He had seen them sticking around the building onto everyone's napes. What is that? He asked as the leader stuck one on his neck. They were also putting blue posters on their backs, but they slipped out of his mind because of the words he heard next. The leader grabbed his collar and pulled him down to whisper in his ear, "These are bombs." Bungie flinched, and his heart started to race once again. I can detonate them at any moment, and if you don't want it to happen, you will do as I say? Nod if you understand. Bungie promptly nodded. I want you to keep standing here and your men to continue lying down there. If any of you moves, or tries to escape, these bombs will go off and your necks will explode. Boom, she huffed out sharply, making Bungie's knees buckle. So, it's in your best interest to follow my orders. Nod if you understand. Bungie nodded again. While he managed to hold back his tears, he couldn't stop his body from trembling. It didn't matter if his men could see him anymore. He didn't know if the woman spoke the truth, but he had no choice but to believe her. A slip of paper in the hand of a shinobi could be a bomb. Before we bid you farewell, I have one more thing to tell you, the leader said to Bungie. The next words she said were an address that Bungie recognized instantly. His eyes turned into saucers as he stared at the woman. It was the address of a shop he owned in an area very far away from the nearest main road. The shop itself wasn't that important, but the things inside were very important to him and the wrench gang. We also don't like your main business, so we'll go and clean up your inventory. And no, you can't do that. Please don't do that, Bungie begged. He was lucky to hit it off with a group of shinobi to whom he had once sold drugs to. They had found him again in a few days and bought more than the last time, and then it turned into a weekly affair. It seemed that the group of shinobi had become drug providers to their entire shinobi army, and in turn, the wrench gang had turned into their suppliers. There were lots of drugs and loose cash in that shop, and even though there were 7 people protecting and working in that shop, it wouldn't matter against 1 shinobi, let alone 4. The wrench gang couldn't afford to lose their inventory and cash. If he lost his inventory, he would be unable to fulfill his clients' demands, and they would turn to someone else, which would shatter his business. He also wouldn't be able to buy more because he had already taken a line of credit from the Goharu family, which they would put pressure on him to pay back. He was fucked. I suggest going into hiding, she whispered into his ear. Now, keep standing here and watch what will happen if your gang goes against anything I said today. You can leave when you get the signal, don't worry about not getting it, you'll know what it is. Bungie wanted to beg them to leave his inventory and money alone, but the masked group left him alone with his men, who called to him, asking if they could get up. He stared at them, wondering what he should say to them. Keep lying down, he said. He had to run. He had some money at his home, he could bribe the guards and get out of the city. As long as he got out of the city, the Goharu family wouldn't be able to get to him because of the city's lockdown imposed by the shinobi. Just keep lying. Boom! The ground rumbled as the sound of explosions ripped through the air. The force hit Bungie's back, pushing him forward. It wasn't enough to make him fall, but he still did because he felt weak after what he had heard. His men were trembling on the ground in fetal positions as explosions continued to happen. They yelled and screamed in fear. Boom! He turned back to see an explosion rip through the police station, and a jet of fire roared into the sky. Smoke rose from the building as more and more explosions tore the building apart brick by brick. It quickly started to crumble on itself, and he flinched when a large piece of debris flew into the air. For a moment, he thought it would reach them, but the group was far enough that they were out of the splash zone. He sat there numbly and watched the remains of the destroyed building as a massive smoke could blot out the sky. The same tags that made short work of the building were attached to his neck. It terrified him so much he stopped thinking about running away. Boom! Chapter 228, The Mafia. The masked group of 4 entered a rusty, dusty factory as they returned from blowing up a police station. They removed their porcelain masks to reveal Anko, Daiki, Iori, and Kamiko. Upon entrance, they spotted the remaining 3 team members sitting on old couches. How did it go? Asked Gaku as he lit a new cigarette. According to the plan, Anko replied as she dumped herself beside Takuma and Riku. She turned to Takuma. How about you guys? Takuma pointed to several jute and duffel bags piled up in the corner. We cleaned up the shop, tied up the guards, painted them blue, and stuck our posters on them, he said. It was child's play, said Gaku. All thanks to the recon and planning, said Takuma. They're common thugs. We could have gone without any preparation, and it wouldn't have made a difference, said Gaku with a chuckle. And that's the difference between you and me, said Takuma. I don't leave any room for error. Can't you both just be happy that everything went well? Iori sighed as she threw crumpled paper balls at them. He was amazing, said Riku. He unlocked the safe in the office like it wasn't locked at all. We took all the money inside, and I thought that would be it, but then he started poking around in the room. He found 3 hidden stashes, each with more money than the last one. We have a lot of cash. Everyone looked at Takuma. He shrugged. I have a lot of experience looking for hidden stashes. It's a skill I picked up on the job. Takuma had searched and raided plenty of drug stash houses. Some people were creative about their hiding places, but for most, there was a general pattern they followed when hiding things. Okay, now that this is over, Kamiko said as she pulled out a water bottle from a cooler, why did we do this? Isn't it better that the enemy has an unbroken supply of drugs? Let them drown in it. You're assuming that they're all addicts, said Takuma. The drugs are addictive, but not everyone is waking up every day and shooting something up into them before their feet touch the ground. Most people only do drugs at the recreational level. These men are in a foreign land fighting a war far away from their home. They might be winning and controlling the town, but most don't want to be here, they want to be at home with their families. There's stress there that drugs can dull, they can find escape through them. So, you want them stressed, said Kamiko. Yes, I want them to feel uncomfortable in this city to build up tension among the forces. I want them to complain about their time in you. They shouldn't be comfortable. I want it to snowball from minor inconvenience to something like fear, said Takuma. The wrench gang was a secondary target, the primary target was always the shinobi forces in the city. The team's job was to weaken the enemy for the main forces. Takuma wanted all of the team's efforts to contribute to the cause of an increasingly hostile environment for the enemy shinobi. The shinobi aren't loyal to the Range family. They'll turn to someone else, and the entertainment train will continue, said Gaku, lighting up another cigarette. So, we just keep taking out the suppliers, said Riku, slicing a kunai through the air. Actually, I'm counting on them to find another supplier. In fact, I can probably guess what will happen. The Wrench gang was the middleman. With them out, the Goharu family will sweep in on the opportunity because of the increased margins, said Takuma. And you want that? Asked Iori. Yes, I want that, and I want the Goharu family to have unprecedented levels of success, said Takuma. Why? Because, Takuma leaned forward, we're going to poison the drugs. A blanket of smoke still lingered over the building as multiple people put in their effort to extinguish the fires, but the presence of a couple hidden frost shinobi, using water nature ninjutsu, brought both the crowd and the fires under control. Ebi, a hidden frost jonin, walked down the road to the police station in shambles. The burnt-down building caught his eye, but he was more interested in the group of people lying down on the road with his shinobi surrounding them. What is happening here? Ebi asked the nearest shinobi. "Yes, sir." The genin tensed up in attention. These men are refusing to get off the ground. And why is that? They have explosive tags on their necks, and they're scared that they'll go off if we remove them. Ebi gave the genin a look of dissatisfaction. And why haven't you ripped the tags off? Sir, we think they might be true. Ebi looked at the man as if he couldn't believe what he was saying. He walked to one of the men lying on the ground and ripped the tag off his nape without permission. What are you doing, man? Ebi ignored his protest and channeled a sharp burst of chakra through the paper. It burnt the paper and permanently disabled the tag. He observed the tag to sense for chakra palpitations, but there were none. He turned to face the 4 genin that had come to the scene. You idiots need to learn how to disable explosive tags. It's not that difficult, he yelled at them. And find a few Anin who'll teach you to recognize the difference between an explosive tag and a movement trigger explosive tag. Normal explosive tags, for all intents and purposes, were time-based explosives. The moment chakra was funneled into the tag, it would detonate depending on the time interval coded into the formulae. Most tags were set to detonate after a second or two, but they could be coded to detonate after several minutes. The longer the detonation time, the more expensive said tags were. However, there were explosive tags that could be triggered on movement instead of time. Chakra was loaded into an isolated part of the tag, which would be funneled into the explosive part of the tag at the slightest disturbance, leading to detonation. Those type tags were more complicated to make and delicate to use, and looked quite different from the standard time-triggered ones, making them quite easy to distinguish. And these aren't even real tags. Ebi threw the burnt tag away. He turned to the lying men and told them that they weren't going to blow up. He sighed. It was embarrassing that the genin didn't understand the tools they were using. They didn't need to be Fuanin with extensive formulae knowledge to recognize the difference between a standard explosive tag and a special trigger explosive tag. Ebi looked down at the men covered in blue and plucked the blue poster that were posted around the city against them. It seemed the resistance was behind the demolition of the police station. It wasn't surprising because the Bentetsu Street police station was one of the stations where none of the police officers stayed on board. But he was interested in the report he got stating that this was the work of shinobi. Ebi raised his hand to call the one of the shinobi who had extinguished the fire. Were you able to find the cause of the fire? He asked. Yes, sir. They used gasoline as an accelerant, and we found signs that explosive tags were used. Are you sure? Are the signs definitive? Ebi asked. We found 2 separate pieces of debris that confirm it. Ebi breathed a deep sigh as he cracked his knuckles. The posters proved that this was the work of a resistance. Now, there were 2 ways to look at the situation. First, someone had supplied the resistance to the explosive tags, and there was someone in the resistance who had the capability to trigger the tags, which wasn't difficult as not much chakra was needed to trigger the tags. A second-year academy student triggers the tags. Teaching someone to channel enough chakra for blowing up tags wasn't tricky. The second option was that there were shinobi among the resistance. It meant there were enemy shinobi in the city. The second option was much worse. Ebi was staring at the poster when he sensed a gaze. His eyes sharpened, and he looked around to find a man standing in the shadow of a tree. Ebi recognized the man and walked toward him to have a chat. "You find out about this quickly," Ebi told the man. Khan nodded. "I wouldn't be very good at my job if I couldn't find out about an explosion destroying one of the city's police stations." Ebi gazed at the man. Khan wasn't part of the Hidden Frost, nor was a Hidden Cloud shinobi. Ebi didn't know where Khan came from, but he was sent to help them take control of the city. There were 5 Jonin in the city, but none of them had any experience in controlling and converting a foreign city. The higher-ups at home had sent Khan and his team of masked men to give them their experience. Ebi didn't like Khan, but the man had done a great job extending their influence over the city in a short period of time. "We found explosive tags," said Ebi. "And?" asked Khan. "One of those men said that the masked people who did this, one of them punched through a pillar. I think it's safe to assume that we have at least one shinobi in this city. Worst case scenario, there are 4 unknown shinobi running free in the city. Worst case, we have 7 shinobi," said Khan as he looked at the demolished building. "These men are from the Wrench Gang. Their stash house was raided at the same time this happened. It seems they specifically targeted the Wrench Gang." "I have heard of them," said Ebi. He might not be well versed in how to take over cities, but he had familiarized himself with the city on a level. He had heard of the Wrench Gang because of their dealings with his shinobi. "I fear that this will have a negative impact on our efforts. I hope you have a plan for this." "Well, if they're so keen on blowing up police stations, then how about we help them blow up another one?" Khan smiled. "We will even throw some people as gifts." "Poison their drugs?" asked Kamiko. Daiki's eyes shined. "We're going to poison their drugs to kill them?" "No!" Takuma, Gaku, and Anko all yelled at Daiki, who physically took a step back at the strong rebuke. "If we poison their drugs enough to kill them, they're going to take it out on the city," said Gaku. Takuma nodded in agreement. "There's no telling how they'll respond. There's a very high chance that they won't stop those involved in the drug trade and punish everyone for establishing control by spreading fear. We'll have different ways to kill them." "Then what?" "How much can we poison them?" asked Iori. "Just enough to make them seriously sick for a while without actually being lethal," said Takuma. "What do you think happens when drugs that keep their minds occupied suddenly make them extremely sick?" "They stop taking them," Anko replied. Takuma snapped his fingers as he pointed at her. "They'll stop taking the drugs. Once the drugs are tainted, the shinobi are never going to touch any drug that comes from you, no matter who gives it to them. They'll be too scared that the next time, it won't end up with them only getting sick." He looked at Gaku and Renji. "When you poison the soil, all the fruit, no matter the tree, is poisoned. And once drugs are out of the equation, the stress would continue to pile up. The city is running low on alcohol, so it's a good time for us to make this move," said Takuma. "If the plan was to poison the drugs, why did we screw over the Wrench Gang?" Daiki asked. "We could have just tainted their drugs." "Because the Wrench Gang is a small fish, but the Goharu family is a big player," said Takuma. "There were 2 big underworld mafia families in Yu. The Goharu family and the Hadani family. When Yu was invaded, the Goharu family sided with the enemy, who gave them power, and the Hidani family, who were once equal, were no longer in power. The Gohari family was introduced into the police force, giving them the power of the law enforced by shinobi. The Hadani family was immediately pushed back and lost much of their control over the city. If we tainted Wrench Gang's drugs, the Goharu family would have used them as scapegoats, but when they start providing drugs directly to the shinobi, they will get a serious blowback from the shinobi," said Takuma. "There's going to be serious tension between the enemy and their local lackeys. It'll decrease their influence because even though they're lackeys, even lackeys can be resentful." Takuma leaned into his seat. As expected of working in narcotics at the police force, said Anko. Takuma took in a deep breath and sighed. Yeah, that's where that came from. Chapter 229, Security. Gaku was grateful for his cover identity as Chinatsu's pimp, Jimiai, but he didn't take the job expecting to enjoy it. Turns out, spending his days in high-end men's clubs, sipping on expensive alcohol, wasn't a terrible way to spend his evenings. Perhaps he had judged the snobs too harshly. Chinatsu was happy with Gaku's ability and paid him a fair commission for his services, one he didn't have to share with the team and used to get some really good, choice booze, and other creature comforts. He pulled a fat cigar from his robes and almost took out a kunai to remove the cap but caught himself and used a proper cutter to snip the cap. He sparked his lighter and toasted the tobacco end before igniting the cigar and taking a big puff. The waiter came with a drink and spoke to Gaku as he set it down. Mr. Fumito would like to talk to you in his private room. The waiter slid a paper slip with a room number beside the glass. Gaku hid a smile. He could sit in these clubs and bars with the owners aware of who he was because their members and clients wanted what he could provide. The Fumito fellow was now a target that he needed to vet for Chinatsu. It was time to get to work. As the waiter turned to leave, Gaku stopped him. Hey, boy. What's he like? Said Gaku. He could market Chinatsu to any man, but it was always nice to know what the target wanted so he could use that in his pitch and maybe even give Chinatsu some information she could work with later. Lose the cigar, he doesn't like the smell, said the waiter after telling what he knew about Fumito. Gaku tipped the boy for his information, put out the cigar, and downed his drink before going to the room number on the paper slip. As he walked, he stealthily weaved hand seals. A veneer of chakra covered his body, erasing the smell of booze and smoke from his mouth and body. He popped a breath mint as an unnecessary precaution just to make sure. He stopped in front of the door and took a deep breath. He relaxed his shoulder, leaned his neck forward just a smidge, stood up a bit less straight, and stretched a broad smile on his face. He knocked on the door before entering the private room, which was set up like a lounge. It was clear that Fumito was planning to meet some friends and had fit Gaku in before they arrived. Ah, good day, Master Fumito. You're the picture of good health, he said. Jimiai was much more upbeat than Gaku. Fumito was the usual client demographic for Chinatsu. An older middle-aged man, wealthy, and someone who didn't mind using his wealth to feel powerful and important by having the beautiful fawning over them. Sex itself was about to power. I've heard that there's a new beautiful woman in the city, said Fumito, a bald man with a pot belly, who was dressed sharply, making him look much more presentable. Lady Chinatsu has a rare ethereal beauty that is quite hard to find. Gaku passed some photos to Fumito. Her beauty extends beyond her visage. She's full of grace and poise, her every movement refined to reflect everything exquisite about womankind. Gaku smiled when he saw visible interest bubble up in Fumito. He didn't think he needed to say more because few women in a town like you so close to the border could match her beauty, and none worked as courtesans. All of these pictures are with clothes, said Fumito. Gaku wanted to sigh deeply. Did mystery no longer mean anything? Lady Chinatsu's naked visage is for the eyes only. A reward and privilege only for those who prove themselves to be men amongst men, those who prove to her that they're true men, said Gaku. The wealthy in you were considered the highest class in the city. They not only had money, but they also had power in the form of owning businesses that employed the people. They directly exerted influence over others' lives, but ever since the enemy had occupied the city, they had been knocked down from their thrones, replaced by a new power, one they couldn't even dream to dethrone. Power was a potent drug. Once someone had a taste, it was easy to get addicted. The wealthy men in you, who always had been at the top, wanted to feel powerful. They were used to it, but things were different with a foreign power controlling their house, and having a beautiful woman like Chinatsu giving all of her attention to them was the dose of power they craved. Gaku decided to hammer in the last nail. Lady Chinatsu was quite famous in the capital, said Gaku, gaining Fumito's complete attention. She had several admirers in Daimyo's court, known for her singing and her skill with the shamisen. Chinatsu, not being a native, had an exotic charm to herself. Her being from the capital city was a real value point for country bumpkins like Fumito from you. A courtesan from their country's beating heart, someone who walked within the daimyo's court, was a pull no one in you could deny. I would like to meet Lady Chinatsu, said Fumito, his eyes now stuck to the photos. Gaku's smile couldn't grow bolder. Anything for you, Master Fumito. I'm sure Lady Chinatsu would be elated to meet you. Gaku parted with Fumito after discussing future plans. He didn't need much as Chinatsu's pimp. One meeting per week made her more than enough money because she charged an exuberant amount on an hourly basis, and if every client spent 2 to 3 hours with her, she essentially earned just as much as he was earning at his peak as a hidden steam chunin. And she was already doing 2 meetings per week. If it continued, she would earn double what he made. Life was indeed unfair. With the meeting set up, his job for the day was over. As Gaku was about to leave, he saw a group of men across the hallway. He didn't even need to guess. The way they walked and the weapon pouch hanging from their backs was enough to identify them as shinobi. He quickly crossed the hallway and followed the shinobi to see them enter a private room. A waiter passed him. Gaku grabbed him by his shoulder. The waiter was a decently sized guy, but Gaku lifted him off the ground with ease before he placed him beside himself. Who are those people? He asked. They're shinobi. Are they regulars? I think one of them has been visiting for the past 2 months. They said he's a chunin. He brings a group with him sometimes. Gaku released the waiter's shoulder, handed him some money, and let him go. He walked closer to the room and tried to listen, but the door and walls were thick enough to prevent the sound from leaking. This was a chance to establish contact with the enemy. If he could market Chinatsu to the chunin and somehow make him a regular, there was a chance they could get some information from the chunin through Chinatsu. A direct line like that would be more valuable than the information Takuma had been collecting through his recon and stakeouts. He turned away from the door. He had to check the plan with the team and get Anko's approval to proceed. But then Gaku stopped and turned around to face the door. He could do it now. He had to do it now. It would take time for Chinatsu to build a rapport with the man, and who knows how long it would take to get some valuable information. They couldn't delay this. If he backed off today, who knows when the chunin would return to the club and when Gaku would get to bring up Chinatsu. Gaku decided he was going in. It was better to listen to their praises rather than ask for permission. He released a deep breath, and at the end of it, he put on the biggest smile with energy lighting up his face. And with that, he knocked on the door. You did what? At Chinatsu's house, Anko yelled at Gaku after he told her he had managed to set a meeting between Chinatsu and an enemy shinobi. That's great, said Chinatsu as she came downstairs to the dining room and gave Gaku a kiss on his cheek. She turned to Anko. This is a good thing. Why are you scolding him? Because we don't know what kind of person he chose, Anko glared at Gaku in displeasure. He might be a chunin, but we didn't vet him. He might be the violent kind. We can't guarantee your safety, but we can at least try to reduce the risk. He might have a possessive stalker personality and might get forceful. There were a dozen steps that he outright skipped without a word of consultation. Other than Takuma, the entire team was present in the dining room and were waiting for Gaku to return so they could eat together. But then he reported about his progress and made dinner an afterthought. Chinatsu gazed at Gaku, who shrugged. She turned to Anko. Don't worry, I can handle him. He might be a shinobi, but he's still a man, Chinatsu said as she sat down on the chair beside Gaku. Her every movement was sensual. You have your skills, ladies, I have mine. I know how the inside of a man's mind works, and I know what strings to pull to get what I want. You're a civilian, Chinatsu, said Iori. We can't put you at more risk than you're already. Oh, please, I wouldn't have agreed to do any of this if I was scared of the risk, Chinatsu scoffed. I want to do this. I have to do this. A dark look flashed past her face before she smiled and leaned into Gaku, who hugged her. Chinatsu hadn't left her very successful courtesan career in the capital to help them at you for no reason. She had personal reasons to help. Chinatsu's brother was a hidden steam shinobi killed in action during the war. He was only a genin at the front lines and was unlucky enough to meet his end on the battlefield. Revenge was Chinatsu's motivation. Any help she could provide, she was ready to contribute, even if that meant abandoning her cushy life and putting herself in great danger for shinobi who weren't even from the hidden steam. "Let me do this," said Chinatsu. Anko gazed at Chinatsu with a complicated expression. The look of revenge in Chinatsu's eyes felt so familiar. It was a horrifying mirror. Anko had her life destroyed and her reputation ruined, probably forever. There were scars that had never healed, and the flames of revenge would continue to burn until the day she saw Orochimaru's corpse with her own two eyes. Anko sighed. "Very well, if that's what you desire, but only if Takuma signs off on it." Gaku looked severely displeased by her decision, and she could understand why. Due to their relationship, Takuma took a comb through each and every one of Gaku's proposals, and if he found any legitimate error, he would scrap the proposal. They worked together, but they had real friction between them. Anko didn't have the heart to refuse Chinatsu her purpose, so she dumped the decision on Takuma, hoping he would do the right thing. Chapter 230, The Haunting Past. "This is very good," Takuma said, giving a nod to Gaku. "Really?" said Anko, surprised by his reaction. Given their relationship, she was sure Takuma would rip into Gaku. The three of them were alone in the factory base. She had wanted to run Gaku's plan by Takuma because she doubted her ability to look at the situation impartially and because Chinatsu was the cornerstone of their cover identity. Putting her close to an enemy shinobi would risk them all getting exposed. It was a risky move, yes, but he was able to convince them, and if she manages to convert the Chunin into a regular and gain his trust, we're golden, Takuma said as he worked on sorting objects collected from around the factory like screws and bolts using chakra strings. "That's what I said," Gaku smiled victoriously at Anko. "I'll coordinate with Chinatsu and prepare her for the information we want from the guy. Leave it all to me." "Yeah, let's not get ahead of us there. This one thing going well doesn't mean everything will. Anko and I need to be keyed into everything you plan to do," said Takuma. Gaku opened his mouth to argue, but Takuma cut him off before he could speak. "You can take the lead on this, but we need to be aware of everything before it happens." "Got it?" Gaku was peeved, but he didn't say anything. On the other hand, Anko was surprised that Takuma gave Gaku the lead. She thought he would take on the lead from Gaku, but she nodded as she agreed that she needed to know about things before they happened. She allowed Takuma some freedom to operate independently but wouldn't extend that treatment to Gaku. "All right, keep in touch," Takuma said as he got off the couch and grabbed his weapon pouches and a long hooded overcoat to hide everything underneath. "Going out?" asked Anko. "Yeah, I think I have a lead on the Goharu family." Takuma looked at Gaku. "I followed that guy from the Goharu family, and I think I found their stash house." "I knew they'd come in handy," said Gaku. The resistance group led by Motohiro had helped the team spread the anti-occupation posters around the city. They agreed with what the team was doing and wanted to help more. Seeing their success, the team decided to give Motohiro's group another job, to find the Goharu family's drug stash house. Takuma wanted to poison the drugs, but for that to happen, they needed to find the packaging and stash house. The team didn't have enough time to find it by themselves, so Takuma decided to outsource it to the resistance group, which knew the city better than the team. They failed to find it. The Goharu family had done an excellent job of keeping it hidden. However, they found a high-ranking person inside the family who was connected to Goharu's drug trade, which was good enough as Takuma spent a few days following that guy and found the stash house. "I'll confirm it today," he said to Anko, after which, "you and Daiki can go in to map the interior and plan how you want to do it." "That's fine by me," said Anko. "I want to talk to you." "Sure, let's go," said Takuma. "You really gave Gaku the lead, just like that?" Anko said as they walked to the back entrance to the factory building. "I would have liked to have the lead, but it's clear that Chinatsu trusts him the most. She'll be putting herself in danger by fishing for information, so it's imperative that she does whatever is asked of her. She needs to feel comfortable, and Gaku is the best choice for it. I could take the lead and ask Gaku to cooperate, and he might support me in the open, but he'll instruct her differently behind our backs. Takuma shrugged. It's better to let him have this one. At least this way, there's no risk of Chinatsu blowing our cover because of conflicting instructions. Anko thought that she would need to discipline Takuma about letting his personal feelings for Gaku interfere with the mission, but here he was, proving her wrong. He was self-aware enough to realize that Gaku was the best choice to directly work with Chinatsu. Good job. And well, if he screws up and Chinatsu ends up blowing our cover, I'll be safe. Takuma smiled and patted her on the back. I can't say that about you guys, though. Anko was left speechless as she watched Takuma leave the factory while chuckling to himself. He might find it amusing, but Anko didn't find it funny as she looked back at the base corner where Gaku probably had a cigarette in his mouth. Takuma sat perched on a roof, staking out the Goharu family building identified as the drug stash house. As he observed the building, it couldn't be clearer that the building was important. There were 2 guards with swords at both entries, the windows were boarded and barred, and anyone who stood close to the building for any reason was asked to move or leave under the threat of violence. He had yet to go inside to confirm that the building was the drug stash house, but he didn't need to because one of the guards was particularly talkative and openly yapped to his partner about what was going on inside. To the guard's credit, he didn't talk about it around strangers, but Takuma's ears were much sharper than the average guy, and he caught the conversation when the guard confirmed no one was in earshot. So why was Takuma staking out the building when he already had confirmation? In a conversation between the talkative guard and a packer working in the building, he heard that today was the fulfillment day of an important big order that got Takuma interested. He wanted to confirm his hunch that the big order was related to the enemy shinobi. A carriage pulled up in front of the building while Takuma watched. A minute later, a bald man with a long scar on the top of his bald head stepped out of the building with a large duffel bag. He wore a tacky suit and shaded sunglasses and entered the carriage with 2 other sword-carrying men, most probably for protection. Takuma got up and started the carriage from the rooftops. The bald man was Waichi. He was the Goharu family higher-up found by Motohiro's resistance group. Takuma had followed to find the drug stash house. Waichi was the brother-in-law of the Goharu family's current head, a fortune that had granted him a privileged position in the family. When Takuma arrived today, he didn't know if Waichi would be involved with the big order, but seeing him come out of the building with a duffel bag strengthened Takuma's belief that it was for the enemy shinobi. In that case, Waichi taking point made sense. He had clearly attained his position through nepotism, but in the few days Takuma had spent following him, he seemed to be a capable, high-ranking family member. There were advantages to leading the client-facing of the drug trade with shinobi to the Renge gang. Shinobi were dangerous, and having the Renge gang between the family and the shinobi was a layer of separation and protection for them. But now, with the Renge gang out, the Goharu family were forced to deal with them directly and thus had to exercise caution. A 10-minute journey later, the carriage stopped in front of a bar called the Ice-Sphere. Takuma noted the name and address, intending to find out if the Goharu family owned it. Waichi and his guards entered the bar, and Takuma settled in the shadows to observe the entrance. He wished to head inside to take a look, but the risk of detection was high, and his personal safety was at risk as he speculated the attendance of shinobi. It was smarter for him to stay outside and infer the happenings inside from the context clues. Takuma fell back on the rooftop and found a tap. He blocked the drain before opening the top to let the running water pool on the roof for a few minutes. He weaved hand seals for the water clone jutsu. The chakra leaked out of his feet trickled outward into the water on the floor that gathered together into a human-shaped silhouette. Takuma felt a sizable amount of his chakra drain away as a clone formed before him. "I'll go keep an eye on the back entrance," said the clone before disappearing off the roof. Takuma returned to observe the front entrance. There was no movement in or out of the bar for half an hour until 4 men finally appeared at the bar's entrance. Seeing them jump down from a nearby rooftop made it clear they were shinobi. Takuma shrunk himself into a corner and peered down at the bar. From the looks of it, there was a leader among the group, with the remaining 3 as followers. He assumed the leader was a Chunin and the rest were Jinin. As the shinobi entered the bar, Takuma was convinced that he had found the group acting as drug dealers for the enemy forces and that the Goharu family was officially supplying for the shinobi. At long last, he had found the link in the chain he could exploit to shake up the status quo in Yu. The meeting went on for another hour. As White Cheese saw the shinobi out, they chatted outside the front entrance, so Takuma snuck to the back side of the bar to meet his clone. "Anything to report?" he asked. The clone replied with a negative. "Okay, we're going to follow the shinobi to see if we can find something new." The clone no longer had any use, but Takuma had already spent a considerable amount of chakra to create one, and there was no harm in having a secondary opinion, especially since it was his. Takuma and his clone took off and tailed the 4-person group. They exercised caution, staying well behind to avoid being detected. "They're overconfident. They're traveling too openly," said the clone. When Takuma was learning to tail someone, he had also done self-study on how to shake off tails. Shinobi, who frequently traveled through rooftops, added a few simple tricks to throw off a possible tail. One of those tricks was to make the tail lose sight by dipping down to the street level every once in a while. The shinobi in front of them were openly traveling across rooftops without ever stepping down on the streets. Takuma nodded. It's surprising given that the wrench gang was targeted by shinobi. The use of the explosive tag in the Bentetsu police station bombing was enough of an indicator of shinobi involvement. One would think they'd fear that they were the next targets, but from the looks, that doesn't seem to be the case. "Good for us," said the clone. "Is it incompetence, or do they have a reason not to be worried?" Takuma asked himself. Much to his disappointment, the group returned to the area where the majority of shinobi resided in the city. The area was well guarded and the most dangerous for the team. Anko had forbidden them from exploring the area because of the risk involved. "That's unfortunate," said Takuma. "Well, we got the proof that the Goharu family and the enemy forces are directly connected." "Yeah," the clone dragged the word. "What do you think that's about?" Takuma looked where the clone pointed and saw a pillar of smoke that rose and blot out the sky in the distance. The amount of smoke was the indicator of the massive size of the fire source. "Should we go take a look?" asked the clone. "Yeah, let's." "This is bad," said the clone, horrified as he looked down at the scene from a nearby rooftop. Takuma stared at a burning police station building. Flames burst out of every orifice that building had, the windows, the doors, and the cracks in the ceilings and the walls. Spectators stared at the fire from a distance as the firefighters tried to put out the raging fire to no avail. The fire wasn't the horrifying part of the situation. The police station was built on the corner of an active street. In the middle of the street in front of the police station, 3 bare poles were stabbed into the road. And from those poles hung 3 corpses of blue spray-painted men dressed in Yu's police force uniform. If it wasn't already similar enough, they had the blue posters stuck to their chests. Someone had copied the police station bombing. Takuma stared at the hangman, unable to move his eyes away. His mind raced at what this meant and how it would affect the team's plans. It was clear they wouldn't be able to proceed as intended. "I need to inform Anko." As Takuma spoke to the clone, he felt a gaze on him. Takuma straightened up and looked around to find the source of gaze. He scanned the crowd on the ground and the windows of the buildings, but couldn't find the source. The gaze was still on him. He felt his skin prickle as he scoured the rooftops. In the same line of buildings, 5 rooftops away from him stood a solitary man dressed in black tactical gear with a sword on his back. The middle-aged man smiled at Takuma when their eyes met, which sent chills down Takuma's back. "Bro, we have company," said the clone, gravely. 3 more figures in black tactical gear and white porcelain masks were on the rooftops around them. They were all staring at Takuma. He was surrounded from all 4 sides. "Bro?" The clone looked at Takuma when he didn't get a reply. Takuma had grabbed his head as a sharp migraine stabbed his brain and was groaning in agony. When Takuma found himself in the 10-year-old orphan, Shinobi Academy student's body, he wasn't given the boy's memories. It had been a big problem because Takuma had near zero idea about the situation he found himself in. However, instead of memories, he got something akin to intuition that told him things like his name, the academy teacher's name, the address of his apartment. The intuition was godsend because without it, Takuma wouldn't have been able to pass himself as that 10-year-old orphan. However, even that intuition had limitations. Takuma had wanted to know about the origins of the scars on his body, but instead of giving him some answers, he was punished by harsh headaches. For whatever reason, the intuition didn't want him to know about the scars, and every time Takuma tried as much as to think about the story behind the scars, he was punished. It was so egregious that even looking at himself in the mirror would leave him in pain. He had to force himself to not think about the problematic parts of the boy's past like the origin of scars and the identity of his parents. The pain acted as potent negative reinforcement and beat the urge out of him. He wished he knew everything about the boy's past, but it wasn't worth it when it meant getting a horrible headache every time his thoughts wandered in that direction. It had been a very long time since Takuma had one of the headaches, and he was glad for it. But here it was again. Takuma looked up at the man smiling at him. He had no idea who the man was, only that the man was somehow related to the boy's problematic past. Chapter 231, The Haunting Past Part 2. Take a deep breath, Takuma said to himself. He groaned as another hot stab assaulted his head. There wasn't a worse time to get a headache than when he was surrounded by unknown hostiles. A part of him wanted to find out about the first person who had triggered his headache, but he could see a trap when he saw one. The unknown shinobi had set the police station ablaze in hopes of drawing out the culprit behind the Bentetsu police station bombing, and Takuma had played right into their hands. He had to escape regardless of what he wanted because capture wouldn't mean good things for him. Fortunately for him, his hood was concealing his face from view. As long as he could shake them off, he could escape without the possibility of a sketch of his face plastered around the town. "We're leaving," Takuma said, still trying to calm himself down. Takuma and his clone jumped off the rooftop into a side alley and quickly headed towards the police station street, where the crowds gathered. Without a word, both of them used the transformation jutsu to turn into two young women in an attempt to blend into the crowd. Transformation jutsu was easy to detect when one was looking for it, but the difficulty spiked when the adversary was looking at a crowd from a distance. They consciously chose to transform into women in an attempt to throw off their pursuers. "Stay," said Takuma. "Are you sure?" asked the clone in the form of a young woman. It was an extremely risky move to stay in the crowd instead of instantly taking off, but Takuma expected the pursuers to look for people leading the crowd. They moved away from the side alley entrance as that area would be looked at with the most suspicion after people walked away from the scene. "Yes," Takuma whispered as he stared at the burning building for an excruciating 15 seconds. Every second that passed was one where he thought that the unknown shinobi would jump down to surround them. "Okay, I think this is enough time," said the clone. "This is what we're going to do. I will go ahead and try to cross the roadblock to make a scene. Use that commotion to slip away." "Agreed?" The street had been closed off for safety as the firefighters tried to contain the fire. Takuma nodded after a second of consideration. "Go," he said. The clone in the disguise of a young woman took a step forward before unexpectedly stopping. "What happened?" asked Takuma, thinking the clone must have spotted something. "You've got that headache, so I don't know if you noticed it or not," said the clone, "but do you recognize their tactical gear?" The clones were different from himself in various ways. Even though they were complex creations, at their core, they were simple simulacra of the user. Unlike Takuma, who focused on the middle-aged man and his intuition headaches, the clone's first order of business after seeing the masked figures was to ensure Takuma's safety. It was a noted factual observation that the clones didn't have strong self-preservation instincts unless ordered to, as they knew their lifespan was limited from conception. They would put the original before them in every matter and were highly receptive to orders from the original. There could be many reasons why the clone didn't get the same headache as Takuma. Perhaps the clone didn't care about finding out the truth of the matter at the moment, or he didn't have a good look at the man before he spotted the masked figures, which caused his priorities to switch. Whatever it was, it allowed the clone to focus on the many different things that Takuma missed in his fluctuating mental state. "What do you mean?" asked Takuma. "Their tactical gear, it's exactly the same as the assassins from that night," said the clone. Takuma's entire world screeched to a stop. He stared at the clone through wide eyes, while the memories of that rainy night flashed through his mind. He recalled the assassins' gear, washed in the yellow light of their fire ninjutsu. The clone was correct, the assassins wore the same black and gray tactical gear he had just seen a minute before. A phantom pain flashed through Takuma's left leg, reminding him of the injury that had given him so much trouble. He had to arrive at Camp Banana with a walking cane. He grabbed his leg tightly and bit the inside of his mouth as the spark of apprehension from getting caught in a trap surged into a choking swell of fear. "Get a hold of yourself, you've got to make it out alive," the clone pinched Takuma's arm. Takuma looked at the clone, who was still transformed as a young woman, and took deep, calming breaths. "Go! I'll be fine," he said. The clone wasted no time and pushed through the crowd towards the road back on the street corner. Takuma turned to walk away from the scene, and as expected, he heard a loud commotion. He ignored it and kept walking away. With the thoughts muddling his brain, it took him all to stop himself from tearing away at full speed. He couldn't even walk briskly because it would be too fast for a civilian. Takuma stopped when he heard a faint whistle coming above him. He immediately side-hopped and pressed himself against the nearby building. A moment later, a kunai stabbed the pavement where he stood. He could tell that the clone was still alive, but the distraction ploy had failed. Takuma dropped all pretense, shed his disguise, and bolted away at full speed. The civilians yelped and exclaimed at the scene of a seemingly normal young woman turning into a shady hooded figure. They screamed when another kunai descended from the sky, stabbing the pavement close to them. Takuma ignored them and pressed forward. He glanced to the side and saw a masked pursuer, with orange highlights on the white mask, sprinting from rooftop to rooftop, keeping up with him. Takuma changed course very abruptly and turned into a narrow alley off the main street. The unmasked man, the leader of the masked group, dropped down to the other end of the alley from the sky, cutting off Takuma's route. "Surrender," said the leader. Takuma dug his heels into the ground to stop and course-corrected towards the adjacent wall. He leaped up the exposed brick wall and ascended as fast as his legs could go. The leader launched a kunai at Takuma and he spun in a quick, complete rotation, catching the kunai. Before gravity could take effect, Takuma was back on the wall and climbing to the roof. The orange-masked figure leaped from across the street and landed on the rooftop while Takuma was pulling himself up. Using the kunai he caught, he formed bogus hand seals to trick Orange Mask into thinking he was applying ninjutsu to the kunai. The masked man dove to the side to evade the plain kunai instead of deflecting it. Takuma didn't stop and directly leaped to the next rooftop, but he didn't reach it. The leader appeared beside him and kicked him completely off course. Taken by surprise, Takuma managed to raise his block, but was hurled towards a building across the street. Gah! His back smashed against the wall, crushing the bricks and cement. Takuma stuck to it and continued his escape from his pursuers. He ran around the building before dropping down to the street level, and tore through alleyways and bends, sticking close to the building walls and hiding within the long, arcing shadows. It was reminiscent of the night of the assassination attempt. He was running with pursuers hot on his tail. Back then, he didn't like that it was raining, but right now he really wished it was. Yu was drastically smaller than the Hidden Leaf Village, and a big commotion could have the enemy forces come down on him. To make things worse, Takuma didn't know Yu as well as he did the Hidden Leaf. He couldn't go towards the industrial district with the factory base, nor could he go towards Chinatsu's house, and those were the two areas he knew best. For the first time since he had been in Yu, the city felt truly hostile. He cursed himself as he sprinted through the streets, unable to lose the pursuers. He shouldn't have gone out alone. He saw shadows leaping over the buildings and the sound of footsteps as they pursued him like he was a game animal. The sounds grew closer. He glanced back to see the leader on his tail, a few meters between them. Takuma exerted himself to boost forward when Orange Mask appeared at the other end of the alley. Takuma immediately switched to running up the walls again. On the ground, the leader weaved hand seals. He breathed out a thin stream of fire, cupping it between his hands to form a long spear in his hands. Takuma saw the leader cock his arm back for a javelin throw. He wasn't going to catch that. His danger instinct tingled, telling him that dodging it narrowly wouldn't be enough. Takuma's mind moved faster as he cycled through his recollection of the street in his mind as his eyes were locked on the leader's spear. Window! Takuma glanced at the window 1 story above him. As the leader heaved the spear, chakra flooded into Takuma's feet and expunged out of the soles of his feet. The wall underneath his feet cratered as the wall/tree walking technique was overloaded, and Takuma was propelled off the wall. Crash! The glass shattered as Takuma went through the window pane less than a second before the spear reached his position and exploded. The fiery rush of flames managed to enter through the window, and he would have been consumed by the roaring fire if not for his forward roll onto the floor. Takuma had no time to look back and stumbled forward into an apartment bedroom. He hurried out of it in search of an exit, having taken 1 step to run into a pudgy woman holding a kitchen knife to his face. In one fluid movement, he disarmed the screaming housewife and threw a kunai with an explosive tag out of the broken bedroom window. It exploded right outside the window ledge, damaging the building and the room, but it bought him a few more seconds before the pursuers came in. He looked down at the screaming housewife, who quieted under Takuma's gaze. "Shut up and hide," he said before hurrying deeper into the house. He saw an old woman closely hugging a 5- or 6-year-old girl in a living room, both of whom looked terrified. Despite the twinge of guilt in his chest, he had no time to calm them down, so he ignored them. The apartment was small, and he immediately saw the front door up ahead. He was halfway through it when his peripheral vision caught the sight of a large bucket full of water through an open bathroom door. Takuma took the risk and weaved hand seals for the water style, 8 tentacles. Just as he finished the hand seals, the leader stepped into the bedroom through the hand seal. Their eyes met, and both of them immediately drew and threw a kunai at each other. The kunai collided in the narrow hallway, a few feet away from the housewife, who screamed and dropped to the ground in fear. In the living room, the little daughter started crying as the grandmother hugged her tighter. Takuma backed up toward the door and threw 3 shuriken toward the leader. He deflected them with a kunai while the water inside the bucket rose up in a freeform blob and flew at Takuma, who smashed through the front door into the open corridor. The leader threw a kunai through the house as Takuma vaulted over the open corridor. The water blob attached to Takuma and sprung out 2 tentacles that caught the kunai. As he jumped down, he saw Orange Mask run into the street from around the corner. Takuma bit his lip in frustration. He could feel that his clone was still alive and by the looks of it, had taken 2 out of 4 pursuers away from him. Despite that, Takuma felt that as long as he had these 2 after him, he wouldn't be able to escape. The situation was only getting worse. Takuma's directional sense was average in all purposes, and he was already confused about where he was. For all he knew, he could have subconsciously leading them to the industrial complex of Chinatsu's house. The longer he was on the run with his focus on shaking the pursuers, the worse thing would get. Even if he wanted to get some help by going close to Chinatsu's house in hopes that the team would notice, he wouldn't be able to find his way quick enough. He needed to eliminate one of them if he wanted a fair chance at escaping, and between the 2, Orange Mask not only felt less threatening, but Takuma also had questions he wanted to ask the leader about how the man related to his past. "Looks like Orange Mask has to die," he muttered. Chapter 232, Clash of Shinobi. As Takuma jumped from the apartment corridor, he considered his situation. Orange Mask was waiting for him on the ground, and the leader was only a few seconds away inside the apartment. He was continuously being cornered and desperately needed something to change if he wanted to escape. There was no use mindlessly running around hoping something would change. Doing so would only tire him out. He had to make the changes himself. He listed out the problems plaguing him. The combination of Orange Mask and the leader had entrapped well, so the solution was to get rid of one of them. Orange Mask was the obvious choice because Takuma wanted to interrogate the leader in the future. Once he got rid of Orange Mask, there would be much more space and time to shake the leader off his tail. But he had to separate Orange Mask from the leader if he wanted to eliminate him. To do that, he needed to make sure the leader couldn't back up his subordinate. The solution? Get familiar with his surroundings. He couldn't miraculously install a map of you in his mind instantly, but he could build a map of a single block fairly quickly. Instead of running blindly, restricting himself to a limited area was a better choice. The downside was that Orange Mask and the leader would also become used to block the more time they spent in it, but there was no other alternative. Finally, there were the two other pursuers he had to consider. They were chasing his clone, but that could end at any moment. He expected it would happen soon because the clone was weaker than him. It was only a matter of time before the other two masked pursuers joined the hunt, and if that happened, his already bleak chances would plummet to zero. He had failed to escape death last time and had to be rescued by a passing jonin. Deep in enemy territory, the only thing waiting for him was a kunai in the dark and the high likelihood of torture if he was captured. Moreover, his limited area plan also made them easier to find as they were in the same location. Time was an important factor. He had to kill Orange Mask and escape the leader quickly. Otherwise, backup would arrive, sealing his fate. As Takuma landed on the ground, he threw a smoke ball toward Orange Mask, who rushed toward Takuma with his sword drawn. He cut the smoke ball down, causing it to burst into a cloud of black smoke. Blinded, Orange Mask skipped ahead and swung his sword, but it slashed the air. Takuma could have retaliated inside the smoke screen, but he chose to run away. It was time to play cat and mouse. Inside the apartment unit, Khan ignored the crying woman begging him to spare them, walked through the unit, and left through the front gate. His plan to lure the culprits behind the police station bombing had been successful. He had to sacrifice a few lives to taint their image, but it was at an acceptable cost. It was fortunate that you didn't have a native shinobi population, so it was very easy to locate the two hooded men peering down at the scene from the rooftops. Though he had to say, the one he was following was quite slippery. From the corridor, Khan saw Orange Mask step out of the haze of black smoke, looking for the target. He looked around and saw a glimpse of the target entering an alley, giving chase by running on the apartment building. He saw the target closing toward the exit to the alley. Khan pushed chakra into his feet, shattered the bricks beneath him. "Got you," Khan whispered as he drew his sword to cut down the target. But to his surprise, his sword cut through an afterimage. It was the body flicker jutsu. By the time his feet touched the ground, the target was several meters away from him and was heading towards another alley. Really slippery, Khan whispered to himself, but he didn't mind it. He had been in the city for months, and it was getting dull. A hunt like this was just the pep-up he needed. Khan used the body flicker jutsu himself and flashed forward. He saw the target was once again running up a building and followed him to the rooftop and across to the next one. He drew 3 kunai and threw them at his target. It was a mistake to be in such an open area. Plus, the target was in midair with no means to change direction. Once again, he was met with an unexpected result as the kunai passed through the target's body without resistance. Then, the targets disappeared into nothing while he was in the air. The answer evaded Khan for a lengthy moment before he recognized it to be the clone jutsu. It was a basic tactic taught in shinobi academies worldwide with nearly no use in the real world because illusory clones didn't cast shadows, which was an uncanny tell, but the target's clone was mid-jump, eliminating the shadow problem. A vein throbbed on Khan's forehead. He wasn't pleased to have been duped by such a simple trick. Thanks to the clone jutsu, Takuma had bought himself a few precious seconds. He looked around, memorizing all he could about the place. They were in a residential area with small apartment buildings. There was an alley between each building, which provided excellent access and gave him a lot of options. He was on the street, which made him highly visible, so Takuma quickly went towards the alley nearest him. As he was about to enter, he noticed a shadow in his peripheral vision. It was Orange Mask. Takuma increased his speed and dashed through the alley when he noticed that the alleys between the buildings were there for garbage, as there was a garbage collection corner in every alley. He had an idea. Takuma jumped into the garbage collection corner and knelt down beside the garbage. He heard the footsteps grow closer until Orange Mask ran past him. Takuma jumped Orange Mask and threw an augmented punch towards the man's face. Orange Mask ducked under the punch and stabbed out with his sword. Takuma dodged with a quick step back before going in with a counter-augmented punch. Orange Mask pulled his torso back to get out of the punch's range and evaded more of his strikes when Takuma tried to follow up with an agile combo. His skills weren't a surprise, given the skills of the assassins he'd fought. However, he was no longer the same shinobi he was that night. He punched out the final strike of the combo that Orange Mask avoided by pulling back his torso and getting his sword into position for his counter, but it didn't matter as Takuma turned the final punch into a second form augmentation. The chakra flowed out of Takuma's fist and crashed into Orange Mask's face, shattering the mask and revealing the black balaclavas underneath. Orange Mask stumbled back a few steps. The water tentacles snapped forward and wrapped themselves around Orange Mask's wrists. Takuma pulled Orange Mask toward him with the tentacles and went for a stab with a kunai. Orange Mask resisted the pull, broke free from the tentacles' grasp, and pulled his sword up. Sparks flew as the metal scraped against metal. The kunai missed the Orange Mask's chest but left a shallow scar on their left shoulder. Takuma jumped back to avoid a sword slash, but four of his tentacles, wielding kunai, went ahead. Orange Mask's sword turned into a blur as he dealt with an onslaught of 5 tentacles. He couldn't dodge the 3 shuriken Takuma threw with his hands, though. The shuriken struck Orange Mask right in the chest, but he knew they weren't enough. Takuma moved in to strike the killing blow, a stab aimed at Orange Mask's neck. But before he could connect, Takuma sensed a heat and heard a sharp screech. He jumped back, and a second later, a fiery spear impaled the ground between him and Orange Mask. He followed the trail to find the leader standing horizontally on a wall. Khan followed the sound of clashing metal and looked down from a rooftop to see Orange Mask and the target fighting each other. The 8 tentacles was a curious choice of jutsu, but from the looks of it, the jutsu was being well utilized. He waited for a few moments longer to watch the exchange conclude. It was clear that Orange Mask was being pushed back. He silently descended onto the wall and weaved hand seals for the fire release, fire spear. Khan wanted to wait until he had a clean shot, but when he saw the 3 shuriken hit Orange Mask, he threw the spear immediately before the target could move in and land the finishing blow. Unfortunately, the target jumped back, avoiding the spear. Their eyes met, and Khan tried to glean their face through the hood to no avail. It cast too much of a shadow. Khan's hand twitched. One command and he could explode the fire spear, but with his subordinate in the blast radius, that wasn't an option. Orange Mask raised his sword above his head and swung for the target, who kicked him back before he could swing down. Orange Mask went through the wall, leaving a hole in the building. The water pipes in the walls snapped and started spraying water everywhere. Khan was surprised at the display of strength. He even felt the entire building shaking through his feet. The target threw an explosive tag into the hole. It blew up, further damaging the building. When Khan saw the target turn to run, he weaved fingers into hand seals for another fire spear. By putting distance between him and Orange Mask, the target had allowed Khan to deal some real damage of his own, and from the looks of it, the target had realized it. He stopped and formed hand seals of his own. Khan smiled as he put more chakra into the jutsu than before. He pulled his arm back and threw the spear as hard as he could. It screeched as it ripped its target with a smoky trail. At the same moment, the target slammed his hand onto the concrete floor that split apart for the ground to rise and cover him in a dome. When the fire spear struck, the impact fractured the dome. It withstood the explosion but broke down immediately after. Khan drew his sword and jumped down. He would cut down the target the moment he emerged from the dome. However, as the dome crumbled completely, he realized that the target wasn't inside. By the time he reached the ground, he stared at the empty, half-destroyed dome for a few seconds until the answer struck him. It could only be the hiding in the rock jutsu. Khan immediately sprinted in the direction the target was previously running. The jutsu only allowed travel in straight lines, and with buildings everywhere, their underground foundations would block alternative routes, leaving only the alleys and streets as viable paths. Takuma appeared above ground next to the alley. He broke into a run and headed towards another alley between the buildings when he felt his clone die. He didn't know the clone's location or how far away he had pulled the other two pursuers from him, but he knew that the clock had started. Takuma entered the alley and, halfway through, looked back to shock himself when he saw the leader dashing into the gallery. He hadn't expected to be caught that quickly. The leader blitzed through hand seals and breathed out an orb of fire. Takuma thought the orb would chase him, but it just floated in front of the leader. The leader threw a shuriken through it. It emerged, completely alight. Takuma knew he didn't want to be hit by that. He jumped to the side to evade it, but the shuriken burst into a ball of scorching fire beside him. He moved the water tentacles forward to protect him, which they did, but instantly evaporated. Now, Takuma had a concrete reason for why he shouldn't get hit by it. He glanced up at two small balconies that opened on the far side alley. He jumped up the first floor and knelt inside a balcony to get some cover. The leader narrowed his eyes and threw a shuriken above the balcony. Takuma saw the flaming shuriken fly above him and immediately formed an umbrella with his water tentacles. He was protected, but lost even more water. He thought about it for a moment before standing up and drawing a shuriken. The leader threw another flaming shuriken the moment he became visible, but this time, Takuma met it with his own. They clashed for a split second before both went flying in a small, self-contained explosion. Takuma smiled, but knew he wasn't safe. He couldn't just keep standing on the balcony deflecting the leader's flaming shuriken. Orange Mask could arrive at any point, and he would be cornered, so he had to be on the move. He blocked another flaming shuriken with his own before jumping to a second-floor balcony of the opposite building. Knowing he was going to be midair and thus unable to change his direction, Takuma was ready to deflect another flaming shuriken, but as he leaped up and across, he noticed the leader's fire orb move. It was on the right because Takuma was standing on the right, but now as he was going left, the orb moved along with him. Takuma realized something. The leader had to throw the shuriken through the orb to convert it into a flaming shuriken, which meant he had to adjust the orb's location to be in the trajectory of the shuriken. However, the orb was relatively slow to move. He could outrun it. The moment Takuma landed on the second-floor balcony, he immediately jumped to the opposite third-floor balcony, and as he expected, the orb, which had just got in position to strike the second-floor balcony, couldn't move quick enough. When it reached the third-floor balcony, Takuma was already on the roof of the three-story building. He would be out of sight just for a moment. He weaved through hand seals. Chakra accumulated in his lungs, and his chest widened as he took a deep breath. The jutsu was primed, ready to be launched. Takuma recalled the leader used a sword and used his shortened tentacles to retrieve 5 shuriken from his weapon pouch. Whoosh! The moment the leader jumped to appear over the roof, the tentacles simultaneously launched the 5 shuriken. As predicted, the leader used his sword to deflect them, an easy feat for him, but it still meant his sword was engaged, leaving him no defensive option other than to evade. However, the leader was in midair and couldn't change his direction. Water release, wild water wave. Takuma shortened the spread of the wave and concentrated it into a straight spray to increase the offensive output. And the distance between Takuma and his target was more than double than it was now between him and the leader. They were close enough that it was really going to hurt. The concentrated spray of water slammed into the leader head-on. He was pushed back, and with no foothold, he dropped down the building. On his way down, he hit his chest on a balcony railing, and then hit his head on the side of the balcony. This was it, thought Takuma. This was his chance to escape. Chapter 233, Satisfaction. His initial plan was to kill Orange Mask and then shake off the leader before escaping, but now, as he stood on the rooftop after blasting the leader off the roof and Orange Mask was nowhere to be seen, Takuma wondered if he had found a window to escape. He could tell that his two pursuers were trying to keep the whole ordeal quiet for some reason, and the leader was especially holding back. He deduced they were trying to keep it all relatively quiet so they could rope the rest of his team in. Takuma knew if he pushed it, there was a risk that the situation would escalate to a point he didn't want it to. He weaved hand seals for the hidden mist jutsu. In a couple seconds, a mist descended over the rooftops and spilled out down the street level. He jumped down into the thickening mist and was still in midair when he heard the intimidating scratching of a sword being released from its scabbard. Goosebumps rose on his skin as Orange Mask suddenly appeared through the mist. He was ascending while Takuma fell. The masked shinobi's sword struck quickly. Takuma only had the opportunity to raise his guard. The steel shredded his metal-plated arm guards and left a painful gash along both his arms. He cursed as he stumbled to the floor, the water tentacles stabilizing him, holding his breath and focusing on his hearing. There was a pin-drop silence until Takuma heard Saul's rubber against the rough surface. He looked up and caught Orange Mask zooming down at him, barely a few meters away. A tentacle contested the razor-sharp sword with a kunai that bounced off against the sword firmly held by Orange Mask, allowing Takuma to sidestep the swing at the last moment. Orange Mask blitzed Takuma with a sword dance the moment his feet touched the ground. Takuma was pushed to his physical limits as he moved every part of his body. Every swing had enough speed and power to end him. As tentacles rushed forth, but Orange Mask immediately retreated, disappearing into the mist Takuma had created. He realized he had set up the perfect playing field for an assassination. He had a choice to make. He could decide to trust the training he had done to fight in the mist, or lift the jutsu to revert back to the previous combat environment. A shadow cut through the air. One of the tentacles threw a kunai that Takuma caught, and he raised his hands above his head at the exact moment Orange Mask brought his sword down at Takuma. The sword slashed against the flat of kunai supported with both of Takuma's hands. Sparks flew and Takuma's heart leaped when he felt the sword slice through the kunai. His skin tingled at the shuddering sensation rattling his bones. He had felt it before with Kimiko when she used her kinjutsu. Orange Mask was using chakra flow to enhance his sword's lethality. Takuma urged his tentacles forward, eager to put some space between them. They wrapped around Orange Mask's thighs and waist and threw him away. Takuma diverted the water to strengthen the tentacles and commanded them to slam Orange Mask to the ground. He'd used the brief break to prepare his strongest augmentation yet. Orange Mask used his core to spin in the air and got into position. He swung his sword, cut through all the tentacles holding him, landed directly on his feet, and disappeared into the mist before Takuma could even raise his fist. This won't do, he thought. Takuma flexed his back, and the tentacles retreated into the water mass on his back. As much as he liked the flexibility of the tentacles, he didn't think he could split his focus between his body and the tentacles. He needed the extra concentration to focus on his senses to help him in the mist. He held a kunai in his left while his right hung loosely at his waist. "Come on," he mouthed to himself. The mist split near Takuma as Orange Mask snuck in from behind. He turned and blocked the repelled sword with a kunai swing, drawing closer with an augmented strike, ready to turn it into a second form augmentation. Takuma's fist passed through an afterimage. A second later, Orange Mask reappeared to Takuma's right. He stabbed his sword into Takuma's neck, but the blade pierced the back of Takuma's hood as he bent forward at the last moment. Orange Mask disappeared, and a volley of shuriken flew from the direction he'd exited from. Takuma deflected all of the shuriken, but his balance was uneven, so he rolled forward, and a split second later, Orange Mask appeared from above to stab the empty ground. He charged Takuma, who hit him in the crotch with a swift kick. Takuma used the kick's momentum to lift himself up and rushed a stumbling Orange Mask. He tried to take him down to the ground, but Orange Mask eluded Takuma's grab with a skillful sidestep and pushed Takuma's back to put some distance between them while he recovered. Takuma turned back, intending to continue the pressure, but Orange Mask had disappeared. He could do this, he could contend, Takuma said to himself, but he didn't have a clear advantage. He was proficient in low-visibility combat, but his opponent was efficient and even masterful with the sword. If he wasn't winning against Orange Mask, he feared what would happen if the leader joined the fray. Takuma formed a quick-release seal and the mist thinned out. He saw Orange Mask a few meters away from him, trying to sneak around to get at him from behind. He turned around and dashed into the nearest alley just as Orange Mask gave chase. Khan leaned against the building in an alley with a groan and grabbed his head. His vision swam and then everything he saw doubled. He fumed in anger when he remembered getting caught up in another trick. He could almost hear the master instructor, who had taught him to be a shinobi since he was a 5-year-old babe and had turned him into a root agent. He had let himself go. It had been years since he had been involved in active combat. In fact, he didn't like combat, it was crude and inelegant. He understood its place and importance in society, he just didn't like participating in it. He was among the weakest in his batch and his other peers, which is why he had made himself useful in the intellectual side of things and had managed the drug trade for Root. But that didn't mean he was a slouch in combat. He cleared the Root standards in his category. Which was why it pissed him off that he wasn't able to engage the target in combat because he wasn't able to stay with him for long enough. He looked around and noticed mist from the hidden mist jutsu thinning out. By the time he emerged from the alley, the mist was all but gone. His subordinate was known to use that jutsu, but he couldn't figure out why the jutsu was released. Was his subordinate killed by the target? Or was the target able to hold an advantage in the mist? The second didn't seem viable, which, in turn, increased the former holding true. In one leap, Khan crossed the height to the nearby rooftop to find his subordinate and the target. As he looked around, he spotted the target running across the street. His concern for his subordinate vanished, and he furiously chased after the target, closing the distance. Khan heard the sound of fighting in the opposite direction and stopped in surprise. Did the second target kill his other 2 subordinates and proceeded to find them? Khan didn't turn away and continued chasing the target. If he had indeed lost subordinates, then he had to ensure the capture of the target. At the entrance of another alley, Khan blitzed through hand seals for fire release, running fire. He put a finger on his lips and breathed out 2 streams of fire that attached to the walls on both sides and crossed the surface. The fire streams ran past the target and reached the other end of the alley, gathering to form a wall-blocking exit through the alley. The target stopped and turned back to face Khan. With the fire in the background, there was a shadow over the target, which, along with the hood, obscured the target's face. "I'd advise that you don't struggle, I might end up killing you," said Khan. The target didn't reply and pulled out a kunai. Khan pulled out his sword from its scabbard and dashed towards the target, but just before he reached him, he abruptly shifted direction towards the wall and used it as a springboard to shoot himself to the opposite wall and launch himself toward the target with his sword at the ready. The target froze up for a split second, making him a beat late as he tried to follow Khan. There was no time to evade. Khan thought the target would use his kunai to block the sword and was ready for a contest of strength, he had the momentum on his side. However, to his surprise, the target pulled his fist back. It seemed he was planning to trade damage, accepting to be pierced by Khan's sword in exchange for getting in a strike of his own. Khan recalled the target's physical strength when he had kicked his subordinate through the wall. He accepted the trade, his body had been forged from the torture the master instructor liked to dress up as light sparring. The target's strength didn't worry him. Khan had the advantage of range and stabbed his sword forth. He smirked as the blade cleanly pierced through the target's shoulder. He then braced himself for the target's hit, but as he did, he detected chakra. Anyone who trained chakra had the innate sense to detect the presence of chakra, but that sense was extremely dull. 2 shinobi with enormous reserves could be sitting next to each other, and neither would detect chakra in the other. Only sensorinine with a highly sensitive chakra sense could detect innate chakra in a meaningful way. For everyone else, they could only detect chakra when it was being used near them in a high volume. Khan's eyes shifted to the target's arm, which was about to hit him. He saw a translucent blue sheen covering the target's fist and wrist. Chakra was usually colorless when released out of the body in cases like chakra adhesion used for wall/tree and water walking, but it gained a blue color when a high volume was concentrated. Khan instantly recognized that he was about to be hit by an augmented strike with so much chakra packed into it that it had gained a visible blue color, and it was coming directly for his face. He had made an error in judgment. He shifted his body at the last moment to move his arm up to protect his face. The target's fist collided with Khan's upper arm, immediately shattering it to the bone. Before Khan felt the pain, he felt a flood of foreign chakra rampage out of the fist and into his arm. He'd stopped the blow itself, but the target's violent chakra rampaged. The force fractured his shoulder blade and snapped his collarbone in half. Before Khan's body could fire any pain signals, he saw something much worse. The moment the fist collided with Khan's arm, the target's entire arm exploded. Khan expected blood, flesh, and bone, but instead, he felt a splash of water in his face. Before his mind could process the information, the target turned into a human-shaped mass of water and then a puddle. Khan landed on the ground, his left arm hanging limp by his side, and a shoulder that was sagging dangerously. The pain hit him, it was intense, even with the adrenaline running through him. He ignored it, his pain tolerance had been thoroughly developed. But the shock was a welcome addition to help numb the pain. He had traded damage with a clone. He had lost his left arm, taken damage that would require weeks to fix, and then a further few weeks in therapy to regain his original performance, all to kill a clone. Khan remembered the sound of fighting he had heard prior, and it hit him, he'd been baited again. The target had used the clone to draw him away while the target engaged his subordinate in combat. Khan swallowed his anger, held his broken arm with his other arm, and went to find his subordinate. 15 seconds later, Khan was standing over the dead body of his subordinate. His mask and weapons belt were missing. He stared at the bloody hole in his subordinate's forehead as his other two subordinates arrived. "Reporting," said one of them. The target was a clone. Khan closed his eyes, taking deep breaths to contain the rage as his Irionine subordinate immediately tended to his mangled arm. Chapter 234, Two Steps Back. Takuma released the hidden mist jutsu and ran into the nearest alley with Orange Mask on his tail. He looked behind and dodged the shuriken launched for his back, making sure he was routing away from the leader. Orange Mask stuck to his tail like a bloodhound, but Takuma noticed there was a greater distance between them than before. He deduced that Orange Mask was probably starting to get tired. He didn't have that problem because of his endurance and durability-focused training. It was an advantage he could exploit. Pushing himself further, Takuma kicked up the pace, increasing the distance between them. Orange Mask tried to slow him down by throwing kunai and shuriken at him, but Takuma continued to pull away. He led them to the alley where he had kicked Orange Mask through the building's walls. Takuma recalled the busted pipes leaking water and saw an opportunity. He started weaving hand seals the moment he entered the street and completed the seals as he passed by the hole in the wall. The water rose and gathered to form a clone, and the building's occupants, who had gathered around the hole, shrieked and ran back into the building. The clone hid in the building and waited until Takuma and Orange Mask tore past, running off to find the leaders. On Takuma's side, he stopped in the middle of the street and faced Orange Mask. The water mass behind him turned into 4 tentacles, the rest of the water was burned away during his fight with the leader. He had spent more than 30% of his chakra on the 2 clones and nearly 10% on other jutsu. It was more chakra he ever wanted to spend in the first 10 minutes of combat, especially when he spent most of it running away. With a kunai in both hands, Takuma charged toward Orange Mask. He opened the throttle and rained down strikes on Orange Mask, who defended with his sword. Instead of his usual strategy of looking for openings and creating opportunities, Takuma barraged Orange Mask with strike after strike, not giving him any chance to retaliate. Orange Mask was more than capable of responding to a bull attack and defended every one of Takuma's strikes, so he amped up the intensity and pushed his body to the limit, single-mindedly attacking like a rabid dog. His tentacles moved in sync with the offense. They tried to hinder Orange Mask's movements by grabbing for his limbs, splashing water into his eyes, drenching him and his gear, and doing everything to divert his attention. They annoyed Orange Mask so much that he prioritized cutting them, forcing Takuma to reduce them from 4 small tentacles to 2 full-size tentacles. Under the intense assault, Orange Mask was pushed back, but he successfully defended himself without getting cut a single time. Then, all of a sudden, Takuma jumped away from Orange Mask. It was time to end this, thought Takuma as he weaved hand seals. Orange Mask was surprised when the target suddenly put distance between them. The abrupt shift from a full-on assault where he couldn't retaliate bothered him. Seeing the target form hand seals made him apprehensive. He had the choices to disrupt him from completing his hand seals, counter with a ninjutsu of his own, or back away and react to whatever the target was going to throw at him. His eyes went to the tentacles hanging behind the target. If he went in to disrupt the target, they'd stop him, and the target was dangerous enough that a moment of disruption could be enough to spell his doom. Orange Mask considered his second option to counter with a ninjutsu of his own, which felt like a viable option. He knew they were standing in the open and that Lord Khan would arrive at any moment, but he thought he could take down the target on his own. Orange Mask raised his hands and weaved hand seals for the fire release, Great Fireball Jutsu. Their eyes met as both sides weaved hand seals, and Orange Mask's vision blurred. He blinked his eyes, and his vision returned to normal, but the next second, his vision blurred worse than before. Colors started to leak into each other, objects blended together, and the world itself warped. He tried to focus on the target, but he couldn't see a thing. He looked down and saw his own body blurring into the road to the point where he couldn't tell where the road started and his body ended. The Jinjutsu was successful. Jinjutsu, Haze, was a touch-based jutsu that blurred the target's vision and twisted their sense of balance. Until very recently, he didn't think he would be able to use touch-based Jinjutsu in active combat because of the problematic prerequisite. They required him to apply his chakra on the person's skin, and most people didn't allow their opponents to grab them long enough to sufficiently apply chakra for Jinjutsu. Not to mention, Orange Mask was covered from top to bottom. But Takuma figured out a workaround using the water style, 8 tentacles. He poured his chakra into the tentacles and used the water to get his chakra onto Orange Mask's skin. While fighting, each time the tentacles made contact, they left behind a small amount of chakra-charged water on Orange Mask's. The gear wasn't waterproof. The water passed through the fabric and wet his skin, and delivered the chakra to the tenketsu points near the skin. Takuma felt an exhilaration run up his spine when he saw Orange Mask's body language change. He tried to hide it, but it was apparent that Orange Mask was deep in the Jinjutsu, or else why would he stop forming hand seals? Takuma hadn't tested the application before, but the concept was sound, so seeing it work told him he had another combat-ready weapon available. But Takuma's Jinjutsu were supplementary options. He still needed to finish the job. He released the 8 tentacles jutsu and let the water tentacles fall as he weaved hand seals for water release, Spirit Water Wave. The water from the fallen tentacles was pulled into a glob in front of Takuma's finger gun. Takuma aimed for Orange Mask and shot a high-speed water bullet at his forehead. Bang, he whispered. There was no sound as the water bullet cut through the air. Orange Mask shuddered before going limp and crumpling to the ground. Takuma carefully moved toward him with another shot ready in case he wasn't dead. After confirming the kill, he breathed a sigh of relief before stiffening. His clone had died. Dispelling the jutsu, he rushed to remove Orange Mask's weapon belt. After a moment, he decided to take the mask as well and sprinted to safety before the leader arrived. That evening, the team, except for Gaku, who had chosen to remain home with Chinatsu, visited the factory base. The news about the second police station attack had spread like wildfire in U. The team wasn't involved, so they knew it was the work of a copycat, which was a severe problem that needed to be discussed and tackled immediately. When the team reached the factory base, they found Takuma lying on the couch with his arm covering his eyes. His hair were wet from having bathed recently. They didn't think much of it, but then Takuma glanced at them after hearing them arrive and slowly sat up with a groan to reveal a bloody bandage over his other arm hidden from view. "How did that happen?" asked Anko, surprised along with the rest of the team. "A police station was set on fire today," Takuma replied as Riku sat beside him and looked over the bloody arm. "Yes, we know," said Anko. "Well, I ran into the people who did it," Takuma hissed in pain when Riku pulled the bandages, "and let's just say we ended up in an intense game of tag that went a bit too far." "Oh my god," Iori gasped. "I want to know everything from the top," said Anko, her already bad mood worsening at the state her subordinate was in. Takuma didn't look like he wanted to, but he did so anyway. The news about the drug exchange between the Goharu family and the enemy shinobi would have been good news, but when Takuma told them that the police station arson was a plot to draw out the team, it no longer seemed to be of any significance. I managed to escape them and then spent an hour roaming the city as a precaution before returning here. Takuma looked disgusted as he continued. They killed and hung 3 people on poles outside the police station, just to poison our efforts and stifle the support we had rallied in the revolutionaries. We'll have to take steps to mitigate the damage quickly. We can talk about that tomorrow, Takuma, said Daiki, worried. Are you all right? Is there something we can do for you? You can come with us to the home and stay there for the night if you want. I agree, said Anko immediately. Thank you, but I'm fine. Takuma shook his head and stared at the entire team for a long moment. What is it? Asked Anko. I found that. Takuma stopped talking, fully leaned into the couch, and closed his eyes briefly before sitting back up. When that group was pursuing me, I noticed, well, my clone noticed, that I recognized the gear they were wearing. Takuma bowed his head. The assassins who tried to kill me back home, they were wearing the same gear I saw today. Iori and Daiki gasped while the rest stared at Takuma in shock. Are you sure? Asked Kamiko. Takuma nodded. Yes. I, of course, had my doubts, so I got proof. He rose and walked to a nearby table, tossing a hiltless blade to Kamiko. She looked down at the blade. It seemed like a normal blade, but she flipped and saw a pattern of a tree, with its underground roots visible, imprinted on its base. That day, I had to scavenge weapons from one of the assassins and investigated them to find that Smith's touch mark. Takuma pointed at the blade. I can accept mistaking the gear, but with that mark on the blade, I'm 100% sure that they're connected. I guess they belong to the same organization. The atmosphere in the base was indescribable. The team gazed at Takuma, unsure what this meant for them and their mission. I'll have to report this, said Anko. Do it, said Takuma, somber. Tell them to contact Uchiha Kano and the Leaf Military Police Force. Last I knew, she was handling my assassination case. I gave her the knife with the touch mark. She might have some more information about the organization, and now that we know that there are living organization members, we can interrogate them for even more information. Takuma looked up at Anko with a fire in his belly. The look on her face confused him, but then he recognized the damp look of doubt and concern in her eyes. The mission is and will remain my main priority, Takuma stressed. I hope so, she replied. Clearly, she wasn't entirely sure if Takuma's desire for revenge wouldn't distract him from their mission. Khan lay on a bed in a clean room as an Irionin worked on his shoulder. The Irionin had been working on Khan's shattered shoulder for an hour. The operation would continue for another hour to stabilize Khan's shoulder and put it in a position for accelerated healing through further sessions. Khan opened his eyes, revealing he wasn't put under for the operation. He was given something for pain, but he was wide awake. He stared at the ceiling, going through everything he could remember from the chase and fight against the target. The day had been terrible, he'd been injured and lost one of his men. His report back to his superior officer would put his situation in danger with a real chance of getting pulled from the assignment. If, by some miracle, that didn't happen, the Hidden Cloud Jonin would use his failure to catch the culprit behind the police force bombing as a reason to shove their pea-brained ideas into the city conversion strategy. No matter which way he cut it, Khan had to resolve this problem. For that, he needed information, and his memories were the only source. He closed his eyes and recalled the target. His clothes, movements, body language, the jutsu he used, and every minute detail he could pull out of his memories. It was the hidden leaf kata. Khan opened his eyes. Pardon, sir, asked the Irionin. I recognized the vestiges of the hidden leaf kata in the target's combat style. Khan narrowed his eyes as he focused on the little taijutsu the target had shown. Adopted as the base but modified to suit the target's needs. Khan clicked his tongue. He wasn't a taijutsu specialist. It was lucky that he had even noticed the relics of the hidden leaf kata in the target's combat style, but trying to gain deeper insight into the target through his combat style was far out of his capabilities. Knowing that the target showed the hidden leaf kata reduced his search circle to the land of fire. He couldn't be sure if the target was someone from the Leaf Shinobi organization, as the style was widespread in the nation, and every other dojo run by a retired shinobi taught the style. However, the Hidden Leaf supported the Hidden Steam in the Frost Steam War, so it was a reasonable assumption that the target could be a Hidden Leaf spy. But the target had bombed a police station, which was an act of altering the status quo in U. He could be a Leaf ANBU, Khan said aloud, but it didn't sound right to him. An ANBU wouldn't approach the burning police station so brazenly, leaving themselves open and easily spotted. That showed surprisingly bad spycraft. What else? The target must have been skilled with chakra augmentation for this level of damage, said the Irionin. Chakra augmentation, Khan hummed before shaking his head. Chakra augmentation wasn't a commonplace technique, but they were universally present worldwide, which didn't help him narrow down the target's identity any further. Just when Khan was about to move on from chakra augmentation, a thought entered his mind. He recalled the last time he had read about chakra augmentation. The hateful face of the person Khan blamed for all his recent problems flashed into his mind. Chakra augmentation. Hidden leaf kata. It couldn't be, Khan said to himself. Plenty of people in the Hidden Leaf knew chakra augmentation. Khan swallowed hard. Could you send for an intel request, he said to the Irionin. The subject, sir? Jinin Takuma of the Leaf Military Police Force. Where is he right now? Chapter 235, Conclusion. The sun climbed up the sky, bringing about the early morning. Takuma opened his eyes at 6 in the morning in the industrial district's factory base. His comfy camping role sat a few minutes away, but he was separated from the cold, concrete floor by a thin bed sheet. He stayed down for a minute before getting up and putting on some pants along with his weighted gear, a vest and a pair of wraparound ankle and wrist weights. The gear's load had been increased, putting even more of a burden on Takuma's body with every movement. He walked to the nearest reinforced steel column, stopping a couple of meters away. He put his hands up front and punched the air in the steel column's direction. The shadow boxing slowly ramped up in intensity until beads of sweat dripped to the ground around his feet. Eventually, Takuma began to slow down, but he forced himself to cycle through jabs, hooks, crosses, uppercuts, and elbow strikes until he couldn't move without feeling the burn. After letting his arms rest for 15 seconds, he repeated the same exercise with his legs, cycling through kicks until his body forced him to stop. With the warm-up done, Takuma eyed the column before him and jabbed in its direction. The chakra jetted up his arm and shot out his fist. Ting! The chakra from the second form augmentation touched the reinforced steel, producing a sonorous sound. Takuma jabbed towards the column again. Tong! Too much power. He took a deep breath and threw another augmented jab to create the proper sound. Takuma threw second form augmentation strikes at the steel column, judging and training his fine control over his augmentation by using sound. He couldn't train outdoors. Fortunately, the factory was large enough for his needs. As long as he kept the noise down, he was free to do whatever he wanted. Despite how open the factory was, he sometimes felt stifled from not getting to train under the open sky with grass under his feet like he was used to, but he couldn't be greedy. If there were one thing he could ask for, it would be sparring. He hadn't sparred since he had left Camp Banana. Sparring was vital as he got to make and test adjustments to his fighting style and combat strategy by testing them out against living and, more importantly, thinking opponents. And for that, there was no better environment than the ring, a place he missed every day. Takuma constantly moved his body for 2 hours, switching between intense and light stretches. His increased physical conditioning had begun to show results, and the imbalance between his physical and spiritual energies seemed to have shortened. By his estimates, he would attain balance in around a year and a half. His chakra quality hadn't improved enough for him to see any real benefits, but he was looking forward to it. Immersing himself in training could keep him away from his thoughts for so long. He walked to a table where the naked blade sat with the familiar smith's touchstone. Not in his wildest dreams did he think he would see that touchmark while he was out of the land of fire, fighting in a foreign war. He assumed the assassins belonged to a local organization, but if they were present in you, helping the Hidden Frost control the city, then the organization's scale couldn't be local. "Hey, I brought some food." Takuma flinched and looked back to see Daiki walking towards with a parcel. For a massive guy, he had deceptively silent footsteps, but it was to be expected. Daiki was a ranger. "Thank you," Takuma smiled as he received the hot food parcel. Daiki noticed the knife blade on the table and looked at Takuma. "Remember anything new?" Takuma shook his head and sighed. "I feel I know less about them now than before." "I heard Anko's already sent a letter to the Uchiha," said Daiki. Daiki was the team member who visited the factory base the least because of his duty as the muscle. He was either at home to protect Chinatsu or visiting prospective clients with Gaku as his bodyguard. Due to his size, he was an eye-catching figure, and thus, just like Takuma, couldn't be connected to the team. Especially Takuma, which was why he visited the factory base the least. She did. After it reaches the camp, they'll send it to the War Commission, which will communicate with the police force. Depending on how quickly all the parties move and the cooperation level of the police force, we could be looking at a week before we get a response, said Takuma. The War Commission will move quickly, given our mission and location. Let's hope so. So, what's the plan now? Gaku and I will be going to meet the resistance group. We need their support, so we've got to convince them that we weren't behind the police station fiasco. How are you going to do that? No idea yet, Takuma sighed. Hopefully, something will come to me before the meeting. Takuma stood in an empty basement of some building in a random part of you. He wore a full-body robe and a blank white porcelain mask identical to the last meeting. As Gaku talked to Motohiro, the leader of his resistance group, Takuma could feel the other members' eyes on him. The youngsters in the room didn't even bother to hide their doubt and blame, and they knew he was a shinobi who could slaughter them all. That was a huge problem. If Motohiro's group genuinely resented them, no amount of healthy fear would stop the resistance screwing them over by reporting them to the Hidden Frost forces. No matter how you ask, how many times you ask, my answer will be the same. Gaku spoke calmly to Motohiro and his group. We weren't involved in the arson at the police station. It sure looked like your work, and you even went one step ahead and killed this time, said Motohiro, glancing at Takuma. You killed a good man. From the crowd, a man yelled at Takuma and Gaku. His eyes were bloodshot, and his face was flushed as he pointed furiously at them. The people around the man held him back, fearing he would do something stupid. We didn't, said Gaku. Why would we kill those men? Because you're shinobi, Motohiro said as though stating the obvious. One of them was a good man, a great man. Even though he was in the police? Because he was in the police, said the man who had yelled. Motohiro explained, he had been in the police for a decade. He stayed in the force to protect the city when your kind put thugs into power. And because he did that, he was killed. The entire room looked somber. There was a clear distance between the resistance group and them. Just 1 week back, the resistance group was excited and willing to help them, but today, they looked like being in the same room was a grave sin. Gaku looked at Takuma before turning to Motohiro. Be reasonable, Motohiro. If we wanted anything like this to happen, we would have done it the first time. We didn't even know the connection between you and that police officer. Ask around, you've been there for all the meetings. We didn't go around you to get some information. Gaku took a step toward Motohiro, which made the entire resistance group react negatively and move towards Motohiro to protect him. Motohiro raised his hand to calm the group down. Even if I wanted to work with you, my people don't trust you anymore, he said. I'm their leader, not their ruler. They trust me to do the right thing. If they don't want to work with you, I'll follow their wishes. And right now, the right thing to do is to not work with you. Bullshit, thought Takuma. If Motohiro wanted, He could smooth this kink quickly. The group trusted him completely and would follow his command even if they didn't like it. Motohiro's milling business had been feeding the families connected to his resistance group. He was their savior. So, he was talking about separating from the team because Motohiro didn't want to work with them. Takuma stepped forward to stand beside Gaku. What can we do to earn the group's trust back? Motohiro stood up straighter and looked at his group behind him. We have simple demands, he said. We realize we don't trust you because we know nothing about you. We want you to open up about your operations instead of only coming to us at the end when you need our help. We can do that, said Gaku before Takuma could answer. We need a token to support that claim. He looked at Takuma. We want you to show your face. Right here, right now. Takuma was taken aback and genuinely didn't know how to respond. However, it wasn't his first time facing a situation like this. When he was operating as Toby, the drug dealer, he wore the mask to hide his identity, and most of the time, people refused to work with him because of his insistence on wearing the mask. All of his connections as Toby were built on the back of Inomoto acting as a guarantor, which only got him so far, even with the man's backing. He had more connections in the underworld as Takuma, which he had gained through the ring. People like to put a face to the name, so while it shouldn't be surprising that Motohiro wanted to see his face, he was nevertheless momentarily rendered speechless. There were other resistance groups they could work with, but Motohiro's group was the most organized. As a leader, had the perfect level of agreeableness and capability, and the trust of his people without much internal struggle or disputes. They could switch to those other groups, but it would take time and effort. Moreover, if the news leaked that Motohiro's group had broken the partnership, the different resistance groups might not be as malleable as the team would like. Takuma decided to cooperate with Motohiro's group. He had already put the team in danger by getting caught by an unknown organization. He didn't want to create another problem by protecting his face. We agree, said Gaku before Takuma could speak. He gritted his teeth. If he had wanted to refuse, it would have looked like there had been no communication between him and Gaku in front of a resistance group at that. If that's what's required. He reached for his porcelain mask and pulled it down to reveal his face. You're a kid, said Motohiro, surprised. Takuma sighed, having gotten used to the reaction from civilians. He had found that showing his scars was an excellent way to stop the kid talk. Unfortunately, he was wearing too many clothes to strip. So he decided to go with a simple demonstration. Takuma raised his foot, pumped chakra through, and stomped it down lightly. The tiled floor of the basement shattered from end to end. He controlled his strength so only the topmost layer cracked, but the entire room jumped, flinched back, and screaming in surprise, their eyes stuck to Takuma in fear. Show off, Gaku whispered between coughs. I hope this is enough for my competence to be clear moving forward. Takuma ignored his colleague and addressed the citizens. There was fear in Motohiro's eyes, but he put up a strong front and stood up to Gaku and Takuma. One more thing. You're pushing it, said Gaku, his laid-back attitude quickly draining. I said we had simple demands, and this show of trust is beneficial for both parties. We will match what you showed, but before that, you must do something for us. Takuma narrowed his eyes. It was a crucial moment. They couldn't let the resistance group become so cocky that they could hold their support over the team's head as a hostage. Takuma thought for a moment before asking Gaku to stand. The man frowned. What is it? I won't guarantee we'll help until I hear the demand. We want you to help us with a robbery. Chapter 236, Anko-senpai. Anko observed a storage warehouse through a pair of binoculars. The sun had long set, and she stood in the open a couple 100 meters from the warehouse. She saw 2 pairs of guards patrolling the perimeter of the warehouse. They seemed to be civilians, essentially making them non-threats. According to the intel provided by Motohiro's resistance group, the warehouse didn't have any shinobi guards, which made the job so much easier. She was more than surprised when Takuma returned from the meeting with Motohiro's resistance group to report that he had to reveal his face to them. It was understandable why they would want to know, but she didn't expect that play from a group of civilians. Moreover, they asked the team to do something so they could restart the relationship on stable grounding. The occupying forces created an artificial shortage of food in U. Motohiro had been helping his people and their families with support, but a single man could only feed over 100 mouths for so long before funds started to run dry. The solution they came up with was to rob a warehouse with produce set to be exported out of the city and into the land of frost. The food that was supposed to feed the region was going out to the enemy country. That food was theirs, and they felt more than justified to take it back. The group could have done it on their own, but the amount of goods to be moved was too large, and they didn't have any means to move it quickly and quietly. Fortunately, for Anko's team, it wasn't a problem at all. They had a specialist made for the job. She put the binoculars down and turned to her team, Iori, Daiki, Kamiko, and Takuma. It was overkill to bring everyone but Riku. However, Iori was essential to the operation. Daiki wanted to do something else other than following Gaku around. Kamiko was going stir-crazy from their visits to Chinatsu's clients as her maid, and as for Takuma, he insisted on being there because the job was for Motohiro's group. "This is going to be an easy job, so Kamiko is going to lead," said Anko. "Understood," said Kamiko and addressed the team. "We're going to knock the guards out so we can work in peace." There was no real benefit to stealth around the guards. They were bound to know about the robbery, and it didn't matter if it was sooner or later. Upon getting inside, we take inventory of stuff we need, after which Iori packs everything up, and we leave. Iori had a large scroll strapped to her back, 3/4 of her height. The regular, pocket-sized storage scrolls weren't going to cut it for the amount of produce they were planning to move. "Takuma, you're going to keep watch just in case." "Yes, ma'am," said Takuma, putting his mask on. "Any doubts? Let's go." The team put on their masks and stealthily proceeded toward the warehouse with Kamiko in the lead. Anko and Iori paired up to take care of the first pair of guards, while Daiki and Kamiko went after the second pair. Takuma directly headed inside to clean up whoever was inside. In less than 5 minutes, the team regrouped inside, with 6 people knocked out and tied up inside a room. The warehouse was filled with flour, pulses, rice, salt, and other spices. There were bags upon bags made of jute filled with produce that could keep stomachs full for months. "What do you need?" Kamiko asked Iori. Iori pulled the strap holding the large scroll from her shoulder. "We have a list of their needs by weight. All of you choose a few things and pile them separately out by the weight listed on this list." She held up a list for everyone to see. "Make sure bags in a pile are in contact with each other. Any bag that's even a few centimeters detached from the pile won't be stored. Please ensure you don't go over the listed weights because I've prepared according to this list. Go off the list, transfer will fail, and I'll waste chakra. We don't want that." Due to its complexity and skill, the large custom-made scroll required a few nin to operate. Not even Anko could use it. The large mass and volume required a lot of chakra to be sealed. As such, Iori had to plan everything down to the smallest detail so as not to waste her chakra. According to her, the amount to be sealed was cutting it close with respect to Iori's chakra reserves. "Any questions?" asked Iori. Daiki raised his hand. "Yes, why are the same items mentioned twice with different weights?" On the list, every single item was mentioned twice, the first time with a larger weight and the second time with a smaller weight. "Once sealed, all the items inside will only be released together," she replied. "Fulfill the first, larger entry. If there's not enough to fulfill the smaller entry, it's fine, I'll seal whatever's remaining." Anko looked at the 2 entries for each item. The larger entry was the amount asked by Motohiro's group. The second, smaller entry was an extra amount that Takuma had added to be stored separately because it wasn't going to the group. She recalled Takuma's words when they were preparing for the mission. In the current food is a valuable commodity. Seeing how Motohiro was willing to act like that in front of us tells me that we should also stock up on it. It had undoubtedly come in used. She agreed with his assessment. They could pay people off in food through a barter system. If someone struggling suddenly found themselves with a lot of money and used it to buy food, someone might notice and question where they came up with the money. However, with food, once it was inside someone's home, no one would know because it wouldn't ever go out of the house. "Let's do it quickly," said Kimiko, splitting the list items among the team. Iori sat down on the ground with the scroll resting beside her. She closed her eyes and meditated in preparation for the sealing process. Half an hour later, she was roused out of her meditative state. The piles of jute bags had been created according to the list. "I want silence, and I don't want anybody touching me," said Iori. Iori started from the left side of the warehouse and opened the giant scroll to reveal intricate Fuinjutsu inkwork for large storage seals. She approached the first pile and touched it with one hand while the other was on the scroll. The huge pile, almost a story tall, disappeared in a massive cloud of smoke. The ink on the scroll moved, altering the structure of the seal formulae. The moving ink came to a rest when the pile was securely stored in an artificial pocket of space. Iori breathed out deeply. She stayed still for a moment before unfurling the scroll further and moving to the next pile. She sealed the massive piles of food into the scrolls one at a time. As she moved to the right, a sheen of sweat built up her skin, and her breathing grew labored until she was wheezing 90% of the way to completion. "Iori, please wait," said Daiki, stepping forward, worry on his face and in his voice. "Are you sure you're feeling up for it?" "I'm worried about chakra exhaustion," he said, looking at Anko. Everyone on the team was well familiar with the dangers of chakra exhaustion. The worst-case outcome was death, and even if they excluded that, Iori could still end up in need of prolonged bed rest, which wasn't something they could have while they were in hostile territory. Iori raised her hand to stop Daiki from approaching. She was hunched over with one hand on her knee as her entire torso moved with her labored breathing. She looked up at him with sharpness in her eyes. "Silence and don't touch me," she said between wheezes. She straightened herself up and threw her head back in silence for a full 10 seconds before dragging her feet to the next pile. The sealing process slowed, the ink on the scroll moved sluggishly as Iori became exhausted. Sealing such a vast amount wasn't a job for a single Genin Fuinin. As Iori approached the last pile, 7 small bags of dried chilies, Anko tried to stop her. "Stop, Iori. I have an empty scroll. We can fit some in the scroll and carry the rest," she said. Iori ignored her, and her dainty touched a dried chili bag. A puff of smoke later, the small pile disappeared. Her feet trembled before she tilted to the side. She was about to fall when Takuma appeared beside her to hold her up. "You should leave this type of overexertion to me," Takuma said to Iori. Iori tried to laugh, but her legs ultimately gave out at that moment. Takuma held her up and then swept her into a princess carry. Anko sighed as she looked at Iori. She knew that Iori was insecure about her position in the team. Unlike Kimiko and Riku, she wasn't a strong combat asset. Daiki had been active as the muscle, and his stealth experience was also valuable. While she acted as Chinatsu's maid, the courtesan only went out once a week, and the girls were on a rotation on who was going to accompany her and who was going to stay at home. And there was no use comparing herself to Takuma. The night before the police station bombing, Iori had woken up thrice during the night to check the explosive tags. For this mission as well, she had been checking the custom scroll the entire day. She would be satisfied with the quality of her seals, but then she would return half an hour later with a new wave of worry. Iori wanted to prove her value by completing the only thing she could on the team, Fuinjutsu. Even if it meant pushing herself toward chakra exhaustion, she wouldn't let anyone take it away from her. "Daiki, pick up the scroll," said Anko. "Good job, let's leave now." Motohiro stood in his warehouse, staring at the jute bags filled with produce piled up high in multiple heaps. It had been months since his warehouse had been this occupied, so he didn't mind the few torn bags leaking grains, which he would have immediately tried to gather up because of the food shortage. "Big brother, is this real?" asked Wada, one of his close aides and a leader in the resistance group, with his mouth hanging open. "They weren't lying, they really did it," said Maiachi, another one of his aides, gulping at the amount of food in front of him. Motohiro had no words for them. He turned toward the other side of the warehouse, where Tobi and Gaku had a large scroll with them. He flinched when a large smoke cloud exploded in the warehouse, and the smoke thinned to reveal a huge pile of jute bags full of dry beans. He had asked them to rob the warehouse 6 days ago. 2 days ago, he received the news that the warehouse had been robbed, but the two shinobi didn't contact them. He started to worry that the shinobi had abandoned them, and his group began to worry, thinking that some trouble would come their way. He regretted asking the shinobi for a moment, but then they contacted him. "I hope this satisfies you, gentlemen," said Toby. "Of course, it does," said Motohiro. He didn't say it, but he didn't expect them to rob the amount he had asked. He had deliberately overquoted so they would feel pressure to bring more, but he didn't expect to get that overquoted amount. Toby looked at Wada and Miyachi, who instantly responded positively and responsibly, unlike the last time when they were upset. Wada even had to be held back in case he tried to do something stupid. "Then I hope you'll do us a favor as well," said Toby. "What?" "We'd like you to introduce us to the Kumi family." Chapter 237, Shinobi or Pirate. Unlike the Fire Daimyo, the Hokage was a military leader. He didn't need others to handle the military for him. However, one person couldn't manage the tens and thousands of shinobi and the 100,000 civilians around them who worked as the support structure. A hierarchy was established to manage the Hidden Leaf Shinobi organization. In that hierarchical structure, Jonin commanders were one step below the Hokage. They were the leaders and representatives of regular shinobi forces, members of the Hidden Leaf Council, giving them considerable power in the village. Nara Shikaku, head of the Nara clan, and a Jonin commander, was reading mission report summaries in his office. There was a knock on his door, and his secretary stepped in. "Jonin Uchiha Itachi has arrived for his meeting. Send him in." Itachi soon entered the office. He was dressed in simple dusty black clothes with his forehead protector around his head. Shikaku gazed at the young prodigy, who was recently promoted to the position of ANBU captain. He thought about what he was doing at Itachi's age and could only recall lazing around at home all day long when he wasn't on missions. It was hard not to be impressed by the sheer talent before him. "Sit," he said. However, he wondered if he should be worried about the look in his eyes. "May I know why I was summoned?" "I'd appreciate it if we could hurry if it's not important," asked Itachi. Shikaku appreciated him skipping all the niceties and formalities. They were such a drag. Even though he was a Jonin commander, he didn't have the authority to order Itachi, as the young Uchiha served under an ANBU commander, a Jonin commander in charge of ANBU, but it'd be rude on Itachi's part if he refused a Jonin commander's summon without proper reason. Shikaku retrieved a 2-flap file folder from his desk drawer and placed it before Itachi. "I received some information from the Steamfrost War Front that might interest you." "Root was spotted," he said. Itachi, reaching for the file, paused before calmly picking it up. "Is the intel verifiable?" A shinobi came across a group of Root agents hunting for him. He managed to escape while killing one and stealing his weapons belt. There, he found a knife with a variation of a blacksmith's touch mark associated with Root. Itachi removed the confidentiality seal from the file and opened it for reading. How did the shinobi know to look for the touch mark and that it's related to Root? Because he has had contact with Root once before, he recognized the gear. And apparently, Shikaku's side, he found the same touch mark on a knife he pulled off the corpse of another Root agent. Shikaku was impressed when he heard the claims in the file forwarded to him by the War Commission. To escape alive from Root agents once was a rare feat. To escape from them twice was something special. That wasn't even including killing 4 of them. That was something only very few could claim they had done. Jinin Takuma of the police force. "I know him," said Itachi. "Through your mother, I suppose," said Shikaku. When the Root claims were made, it was protocol to run background checks on everyone involved. Itachi nodded. "My mother's student. If I remember correctly, he's currently participating in the Steamfrost War and was involved in an assassination attempt before his deployment." He looked up at Shikaku. "Why did you put it that way?" "That he apparently found the touch mark." According to Jinin Takuma, he passed on the knife with the touch mark to the case officer handling his assassination case. However, I'm sure I'd heard that Root had performed an operation inside the village against one of our own. Seeing that I wasn't aware of it until his report can only mean a few things. Either someone made the evidence disappear, or the police force held back information, said Itachi as he flipped through the file. It's the latter. Why do you say that? There was an assassination attempt on one of their own. That's not something they'll let go. So, why not share the information with ANBU? That would have been revenge even if it took the case from them, said Shikaku. The police force couldn't claim to be ignorant about Root as they were regularly given information because of their position as enforcers. But he already knew the answer to that question. The relationship between the police force and ANBU was in a ditch. The reason sat before him even though he didn't know the details. He asked the question to see if Itachi would answer it. Unfortunately, Itachi stayed quiet. So he was targeted for raiding one of Root's drug farms. Itachi sounded doubtful as he continued, and they followed him to the land of hot waters? According to his account, it doesn't seem like they recognized him, but he could be wrong. Danzo and Root were marked as rogue shinobi upon their defection, and ANBU were responsible for hunting them down and dismantling their network. It would take years, perhaps even decades, to get rid of Root, but it was a top priority task as they possessed sensitive and confidential information pertaining to national security. Upon his promotion to ANBU captain, Itachi was among those responsible for seeing the extermination of Root, which was why Shikaku called him when he received the intel regarding a possible Root spotting. What are you going to do about it? Unfortunately, that's confidential ANBU information, he eventually said. Are you going to send anyone there? It might disrupt the mission being conducted in the city, which will affect the invasion to liberate the city from the Hidden Frost's control. Itachi didn't reply and continued to read the file. Do you think Orochimaru's student might be secretly working with Root? Itachi asked. Chunin Mitarashi? Shikaku hummed as he stared at the ceiling. Taking her track record before and since Orochimaru's defection into consideration, I don't think she's involved with him or Root. Of course, it'd be wise to run a background check, if you have the time and resources for it, that is. ANBU would, of course, have the resources for it. They had nearly unlimited resources. The question was if it was wise to spend those resources on something not required. Anything else? Asked Itachi. Keep us in the loop if you decide to take action from your side. I don't want my shinobi, who are risking their lives, to be blindsided by a clandestine ANBU operation. Itachi wrapped up the file before standing up from his chair. I'll take my leave now. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. Shikaku saw Itachi out before returning to his office. He didn't know ANBU's stance on the matter. Root's defection was fairly recent, and ANBU chased after big names associated with Root. There was a chance ANBU wouldn't take any direct action if they confirmed the lack of a big name in you. However, one thing was for sure. Uchiha Itachi would soon be visiting the police force in his position as an ANBU nin. It was also convoluted and complex, and Shikaku's mind couldn't help but chase several possibilities and scenarios. It was so tiring that he looked forward to the evening when he could have a drink to escape his own mind by dulling it with alcohol. He sighed. He wanted to retire, but then his wife would call him a jobless bum, not to mention his son would surely take the wrong lesson from it. Say it again. Khan stood up from his patio chair with a wild look in his eyes. His shoulder was held together in a tight cast. It was almost healed, but there was still a strenuous rehabilitation process ahead of him. However, he wasn't concerned about anything but what he had just heard at that moment. Jinin Takuma was deployed to the Frost Steam War and is stationed at Camp Banana, which is one of the closer hidden leaf bases to the city. Khan felt his heart swell at his subordinate's report. The kid who had ruined his hard-built reputation en route was participating in the same war as him. Not only could he regain his reputation by completing his mission, he could also get revenge. And? Khan asked. Is he in the city? Unfortunately, we haven't been able to confirm that. The organization no longer has a source close to the War Commission with a high enough clearance, and we don't have permission to use any of the remaining undercover agents present in the village to gain access. The risk has been deemed unacceptable. Khan felt a wave of displeasure and anger rise, but he pushed it down quickly. He stood up straighter and took deep breaths. It wasn't the time to be angry, he had just received good news after all. I don't need the confirmation. I know he's in the city. Augmentations like that are rare, after all, and his deployment status is all the proof I need. Khan turned around to look at the city center in the distance. His mortal enemy was somewhere out there, so close that all he wanted to do was set out to find him. It was so unbearable that he wanted time to skip ahead to the day when he had Takuma on his knees before him. "What next, sir?" asked his subordinate. "Find me the best sketch artist the city can offer," Khan replied. "I want that little shit's face one very street corner. I want every shinobi in this city to memorize his face. I want a hefty reward on him, taken alive. Whenever anyone in this city steps out of their houses, I want them looking for one face in the crowd. He's a shinobi far from home, I want him to feel every ounce of hostility about where he is." Takuma stared at himself in a full-length mirror. He had made a mistake. His communication with Motoharo's group taught him that he could have just used the transformation jutsu instead of using a mask to hide his identity. He had mistakenly applied his previous experience to a different situation. He had used the mask and the hidden leaf because the transformation jutsu wouldn't cut it due to the dense shinobi population, but you didn't have that problem, excluding the enemy shinobi, and he could have freely used the jutsu to disguise himself from civilians who weren't equipped to see through it. He had even taken Iori disguised as Gaku to deliver the stolen food to Motoharo's group, and not one person had said as much as a peep about noticing something off in Gaku. But it was too late now, and he couldn't go back. He was going to meet the Kumi family, and with Motohiro acting as the introducer, he couldn't disguise himself or put on a mask. The Kumi family was the other criminal group based in U. Before the Hidden Frost invaded U, the Goharu and the Kumi families stood on equal ground and kept each other in check through intense competition. Between the police and the two criminal families, there was an equilibrium maintained in the city, which was shattered the moment the city was invaded. The Goharu family allied themselves with the shinobi and gained enough power to overthrow both their rival gang and the police force. The team was aiming to gain the support of the Kumi family. Like Motoharo's group, what Takuma and the team primarily wanted from the Kumi family was their sway in the city, which they used to influence the larger populace. They wanted an atmosphere of support against the invading shinobi, and using the vocal and influential groups to gain that support was the way to go. If things went well with the Kumi family, the team could move on to the next stage of the plan, where they were planning to be much more active in their actions. Takuma heard footsteps and frowned when he heard multiple sets of footsteps. Only Gaku was supposed to meet him in the base so they could leave together. He turned to see the entire team, including Gaku, walking towards him. Something was wrong because there was always someone with Chinatsu. "What is wrong?" "The situation has just changed drastically," said Anko, holding up a poster. Takuma looked down at it and saw a sketch that looked a little off, but it was, without a doubt, him. That wouldn't have been that much of a surprise, given that he had revealed his face to several people a couple of days back but then looked down at the name below the sketch. Takuma. He blinked his eyes, wondering if he had somehow misread Toby as Takuma, but there it was, his real name was printed on a wanted poster. He looked up at his team. The situation had indeed changed drastically. Chapter 238, Start of Infamy. Takuma paced back and forth in the base with the poster in his clenched fist. He always knew that he had put his face at risk when he had shown it to Motoharo's group, but he didn't think it would be leaked so soon. However, more importantly, he didn't think his identity would be leaked at all. "This isn't Motoharo's group," said Gaku before lighting up a cigarette. Everyone had settled down in the couches and chairs. There was a visible tension on everyone's face because of the wanted poster that was posted all around the city so no one would miss it. By the end of the day, Takuma's face was sure to become household knowledge. In fact, the team shouldn't have visited him at the base due to the separation they had built between them for safety, but the matter was too big for them not to meet. "You're defending them?" asked Riku with a sharp tone. "He's right," said Kimiko. They know him as Toby, but it's his real name on the poster. So, at least, they didn't do this alone. She looked at Takuma. That organization is behind this. I think someone from the group went to the organization and told them about you. They must have recognized you and put your real identity out. If the group is involved, then why wasn't Gaku posted as well? Asked Daiki. I don't think they're involved. Anko shook her head with a click of her tongue. We can't be sure. They could have omitted Gaku to better paint the narrative they printed on the poster. It wasn't only his name that was compromised. The poster identified Takuma as a hidden leaf shinobi and used that point as propaganda, claiming that the land of hot waters and hidden steam didn't care about the city enough to send their own people and had sent a foreign shinobi to do their dirty work. Putting out Gaku's wanted poster alongside Takuma would have damaged the story, given that he was a retired hidden steam shinobi and a city resident. What are you thinking, Takuma? Asked Iori when he didn't say anything. He stopped pacing and faced the team with a deep frown on his face. I'm thinking that we have a meeting with the Kumi family in 30 minutes and we're running late. We should leave now, he said to Gaku. The teen was surprised at his lack of comment about the situation, since he was clearly bothered about it. Just meet them some other time or Gaku can go on his own, said Iori. No, I have to go now. It might only be the last safe time for me to meet the Kumi family, he sighed. Motohiro is introducing us to them, but they don't know that the guy they're meeting is the same one from the poster. Motohiro knows me as Toby, and it's safe to assume that he must have seen the poster, so we go find him to see what exactly he says to them, and if he hasn't updated them about the situation, it's safe to meet them. Unlike Motohiro's group, the Kumi family is a criminal group. These guys are nice people. As far as we're concerned, regardless of it's true or not, they could have jumped at the offer to work with the Hidden Frost Shinobi, but lost out in timing to the Goharu family. If I delay the meeting and they find out that they're supposed to be meeting the guy in the poster, they might plan an ambush with the enemy to gain their favor. Right now, there's a chance that I can safely get in a meeting with them and check out their vibe. Takuma was wearing his full gear with a robe covering all of it, but got to changing his clothes. He switched his full-sleeve shirt and pants with a half-sleeve t-shirt and cargo shorts, and ditched the robe. He removed his arm and shin guards and carried them in his pouches instead. Previously, everything except for his hands and face was covered, but now the scars on his arms and legs were plenty visible. This fits, let's go, said Takuma after enduring a light bout of headache. They had gotten worse after the recent incident. Gaku stared at him for a moment before putting out his cigarette and getting up from the couch. The teen tried to ask him to reconsider, but he was set on having this meeting. He couldn't let his problem mess with the mission. If there was a chance the mission could advance, it needed to be done. There was no running away from danger because just being in the city was dangerous. He no longer wanted to stay in U, and the fastest way to leave the city was to move the mission forward to completion. Motohiro and his two aides, Wada and Mayachi, rode their bicycles on their way to the meeting with the Kumi family. As the introducers, they had decided to meet with Gaku and Toby before proceeding to the meeting with the Kumi family together. Motohiro was nervous about the meeting because of the parties involved. Even though he was the introducer, he didn't like the Kumi family. They were hoodlums and thugs who increased the violence in the city. One could say that they were necessary because they kept the Goharu family in check, but it was a solution to a problem the criminal families themselves created. He had known many young men pulled into that world when they were looking for a place to belong, and the criminal families and gangs had provided that place. Then there were the shinobi. Every second in their presence was prickly. As friendly as Gaku tried to be, Motohiro couldn't get comfortable around the man because of the faint presence of cold apathy deep in his eyes. He wouldn't have noticed it because it was hidden well, but there was a time when the shinobi had just invaded where Gaku didn't bother to hide it. Perhaps that made Motohiro look for it more closely. As for Toby, he didn't sense any danger from the kid, which was a concern in itself because someone who could shatter the floor with a light foot stomp was dangerous. He, in fact, had no idea how the meeting between the two parties would unfold. He could only pray it was peaceful, but perhaps that was wishful thinking. They arrived at a lot behind the butcher's market. their designated meeting place. Will they come? Asked Wada. Motohiro didn't have an answer. Even though Toby was the one to ask for a meeting, the poster in his pocket could very well mean that the meeting was off. However, they didn't need to wait long to get an answer. Barely 2 minutes later, Gaku and Toby were standing behind them. Yo, Gaku greeted. Motohiro's heart pounded because he had no idea when or from where they came from. He turned back and was surprised to see Toby dressed differently without his robe. He gulped when he saw the concerning amount of scars on his arms and legs. What sort of life had someone so young had lived to accumulate that amount? He saw Toby staring at him as though saying if he had something to ask, so he wasted no time and took out the wanted poster that was plastered around the city. So, you're Takuma, a shinobi from the Hidden Leaf? Did you do it? Asked Toby. What? Toby took out a kunai, and in the blink of an eye, he was in front of him with the kunai held against his neck. Wada screamed in terror and fell back to the ground while Maiachi jumped toward Takuma but was held back by Gaku with one hand. Did you betray me, Motohiro? I've only shown my face to your group. And today I find it plastered all over the city. And no! I didn't do it! Toby pressed the kunai closer, and Motohiro felt his heart race in fear and horror as he stared in Toby's dull eyes. This was a killer, Motohiro thought, and he was going to die. Please, it was not me, please. You're lying. No, I'm not. He thought about his children, wife, and parents. His wife would take care of the business to support his family, but his son was too young to help his mother. He couldn't help but worry about his family who he was leaving behind when the city was in such a fragile state. Maiachi! Wada! Take care of my family, he yelled with his eyes closed. The thought that they might die with him didn't cross his mind. He held his breath and waited for the blade to go through his throat, but that time never came. He opened his eyes and saw that the light had returned to Toby's eyes. When Toby removed the blade from his neck, Motohiro fell to the ground. He was completely drenched in sweat, he was breathing heavily, and his heart was beating too hard that it hurt. My name is Takuma, said Toby. Motohiro stared at Toby's outstretched hand for long before deciding that he didn't want to be touched by him. He slowly got up on his own with his feet that refused to stop trembling. He looked at Wada and Maiachi and they looked just as terrified, if not more. I'm sorry for scaring you, but I had to confirm you didn't screw me, and this was the quickest, said Toby. You! Motohiro was speechless. He was furious, but couldn't say anything in fear for his life. It took him several deep breaths before he calmed himself down. You lied to us, he said. You asked me to show my face. I did, said Toby. I'm far away from home, fighting in a foreign war. The less anyone knows about me, the better it is for everyone. Motohiro tried to cut in, but Toby continued. It's better for you as well. Knowledge can be a curse, you don't want to know something that might attract trouble to you. Motohiro pursed his lips. He thought about the number of posters he had seen on his way here. This partnership of theirs could get him in trouble if someone leaked the information to the enemy. He knew he could find himself in an interrogation where he was tortured for information. That had happened to some people who were suspected of the police station bombing. Given the current situation, it's important that you answer this carefully. What did you tell the Kumi family about us? Did you think they'll connect him to the poster? Gaku said as he played with his lighter. Maiachi answered, We never said you were shinobi, we told them you were the guys behind the police station arson, but I think with the rumors floating around, I think they'll assume that shinobi were behind it. Not only the poster blamed Toby for the 2 police station arson and bombing and the murder of 3 well-liked police officers, even before the wanted poster, there was a rumor that the shinobi were involved in it. It wasn't a leap to assume that the Kumi family had joined the dots to reach a conclusion. But you didn't say it explicitly, right? Asked Toby. No, we didn't. Then, that's it. Let's go meet them. Motohiro noticed the look Gaku gave Toby, and how it was ignored. He understood they were worried about the Kumi family screwing them over and putting them in danger. And he had to be honest, even though he didn't trust them one iota and didn't like Toby at all right now, it did feel good that Toby was taking the risk. As Toby had just put it, he was far away from home, fighting in a foreign war. He didn't need to do it, but he was doing it. That's the end of this tale for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in another month or so. Peace.